The wind, a ceaseless sculptor of the high plains, whipped dust into Elias Blackwood's eyes, burning like the memories he tried to bury. His gaze, as sharp and unforgiving as the landscape, swept across the parched fields of Blackwood Ranch. The cattle, gaunt and restless, huddled near the last trickles of the creek, there lowing a mournful chorus against the vast silence. It was late spring, and the promise of rain had dwindled to a cruel whisper, leaving behind a bitter taste of failure. Elias, a man carved from the rugged land he fought to tame, stood tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders slightly stooped, not from age, but from the weight of responsibility. His face, weathered by sun and sorrow, was a mosaic of stern lines, his eyes the color of a stormy sky. At 35, he carried the burdens of a man twice his age, the ranch a monument to his father's dreams and his own relentless toil. But dreams, like the creek, were drying up. "Another day, another dollar lost, isn't it, Trigger?" he muttered, patting the neck of his loyal bay mare. Trigger whinnied softly, flicking an ear, as if understanding the unspoken despair in her rider's voice. The ranch was a ghost town of memories, his mother's gentle laugh echoing from the now silent porch, his father's booming voice from the corrals, now filled only with the creak of empty gates. He was alone, and had been for too long. His nearest neighbor, Silas McCready, a man whose ambition was as boundless as his greed, had been circling Blackwood like a vulture. Silas owned the thriving Triple M ranch, a testament to his ruthless business acumen and a stark contrast to Elias's struggling enterprise. "Blackwood's for sale, Elias, you just ain't realized it yet," Silas had sneered only last week, his words biting harder than the dust. Elias had merely tightened his jaw, his hand instinctively going to the worn grip of his Colt, a silent warning Silas understood well enough. Riding back towards the homestead, the familiar silhouette of the farmhouse, sturdy but in need of repair, offered little comfort. The paint peeled like sun-blistered skin, the porch sagged, and the once vibrant rose bushes were now thorny skeletons. Elias dismounted, the creak of his leather saddle a familiar sound in the oppressive quiet. He tossed Trigger's reins to Jed, the ranch hand, a wiry old man whose loyalty was as steadfast as the ancient oak by the barn. "Anything new, Jed?" Elias asked, his voice rough from disuse. Jed, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Just the usual, Elias. More dust. And a letter came from out east." He handed over a thick, cream-colored envelope, sealed with an ornate wax stamp. It felt heavy, substantial, and utterly out of place on Blackwood Ranch. Elias frowned, turning the letter over in his calloused hands. He rarely received mail and never anything so formal. His fingers, accustomed to the rough texture of rope and wood, felt clumsy as he broke the seal. He unfolded the stiff parchment, his eyes scanning the elegant script. His brow furrowed deeper with each line. The words swam before him, a surreal jumble of legal terms and societal expectations. Marriage, agreement, union, Clara Evans. He reread the paragraph, then the entire letter, a cold dread seeping into his bones. It was a formal notification, a stark reminder of an ancient agreement, a desperate measure taken by his dying father to secure the ranch's future, a marriage pact, to a woman he didn't know, to a woman he didn't want. His father, in his final delirium, had spoken of a promise made to an old friend, a debt owed, a way to ensure the Blackwood legacy through an alliance. Elias had dismissed it as the ramblings of a dying man. Now it was a terrifying reality. "What is it, boss?" Jed asked, sensing the sudden shift in Elias's demeanor. Elias crumpled the letter in his fist, his knuckles white. "Trouble, Jed. A different kind of trouble." His voice was low, laced with a bitter irony. He had fought off rustlers, braved blizzards, and stared down Silas McCready. But this was an invasion of his very solitude, a threat to the ordered, albeit bleak existence he had carefully constructed. A wife, an unwanted bride. The words echoed in his mind, mocking him. He had no room for a woman, especially not some delicate flower from the east, who would undoubtedly wither and complain in the harsh reality of Blackwood. He barely had enough to feed himself and Jed, let alone support a wife. He stalked into the house, the old floorboards groaning under his weight. The interior was Spartan, reflecting his life. A rough-hewn table, a few sturdy chairs, a cot in the corner of the main room. A thin layer of dust covered everything, proof of his indifference to domesticity. He flung the letter onto the table, pacing like a caged wolf. How could his father have done this to him? A forced marriage. It was an archaic relic, a cruel twist of fate designed to break him further. His heart, already guarded by layers of grief and resentment, felt a fresh pang of betrayal. He imagined her, a simpering high society lady, with soft hands and an even softer constitution. She would take one look at Blackwood, at the dust and the desolation, at him, and flee back to wherever she came from. Or worse, she would stay, a constant reminder of his father's final, desperate act, a drain on his meager resources, a source of endless aggravation. "No," he muttered to the empty room. "I won't have it." But the letter was clear. The agreement was legally binding. If he refused, he would forfeit the ranch, losing everything his family had worked for, everything he had fought to save. Silas McCready would swoop in like the vulture he was, picking the bones clean. He sank onto a chair, burying his face in his hands. He was trapped, forced into a union he despised, with a woman he knew nothing about, all to save a ranch that seemed determined to die anyway. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, a stark contrast to the darkness gathering in Elias's soul. He would meet her. He would fulfill the letter of the law, but he would make it clear. She was an obligation, a transaction, nothing more. His heart, he vowed, would remain untouched, impenetrable. This unwanted bride would find no warmth at Blackwood Ranch, only the cold, hard reality of a man broken by the West and a promise he was forced to keep. Hundreds of miles away, in the bustling, sophisticated confines of St. Louis, Clara Evans stood by her window, gazing at the vibrant city life unfolding below. Carriages rattled over cobblestones, elegantly dressed ladies strolled past, and the air hummed with the energy of progress. It was a world of opportunity, of grand houses and social graces, yet for Clara it felt increasingly like a gilded cage. At 22, Clara possessed a quiet beauty that belied an inner strength forged by early hardship. Her eyes, the color of warm honey, held a gaze both gentle and intelligent. Her hands, though delicate, were capable, having learned to manage the small household her widowed mother had left behind. When the letter arrived, meticulously penned and stamped, bearing news of an arranged marriage in the distant West, it was not met with the horror one might expect. Instead, a flicker of something akin to hope, however faint, ignited within her. Clara's life had been one of quiet struggle since her father's death. Her mother, a woman of gentle spirit but poor health, had relied on a small inheritance that slowly dwindled. The letter from a lawyer representing the Blackwood family spoke of an agreement made years ago between her grandfather and Elias's father, a pact to unite their families and fortunes should circumstances demand it. And circumstances, for Clara, were now demanding. Her mother's illness had progressed, leaving Clara with mounting medical bills and the growing realization that their remaining funds would soon vanish. The arranged marriage, initially a shocking proposition, now appeared as a stark if desperate solution. It offered security, a home, and a chance to escape the encroaching poverty that threatened to engulf her. She held the letter, her fingers tracing the unfamiliar name, Elias Blackwood, a rancher in the West. The words conjured images of vast open spaces, untamed wilderness, and a life utterly unlike anything she had ever known. Fear mingled with a strange sense of anticipation. She was leaving everything familiar behind, venturing into the unknown to marry a stranger. But St. Louis, for all its comforts, no longer felt like home. It felt like a trap, slowly closing in. "Are you truly going, Clara?" her Aunt Bethany had asked, her voice laced with disapproval. Bethany, Clara's mother's sister, a woman of rigid social conventions, saw the West as uncivilized, a place unfit for a lady. To marry a man you've never met? It's scandalous. Clara had met her aunt's gaze with a steady calm. "It's an opportunity, Aunt Bethany, and a necessity." She hadn't explained the full extent of their financial troubles, unwilling to burden her already critical aunt. The truth was, she needed this. She needed a chance to build a new life, to carve out her own destiny, even if it began with an unwanted union. The preparations were swift and practical. Clara packed her few cherished possessions, her mother's locket, a worn copy of her favorite book of poetry, and a sturdy sewing kit. Her wardrobe consisted of sensible, durable dresses, chosen for function over fashion. She knew the West would demand practicality, and she was determined to meet its challenges head-on. The journey itself was an ordeal. The train ride was long and monotonous, the air thick with smoke and the smell of coal. She passed through towns that grew progressively smaller, giving way to endless plains, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional cluster of trees. Each mile deepened her sense of isolation, yet also strengthened her resolve. She was leaving behind the comforts of the East, but also its constraints. When the train finally pulled into the dusty, bustling station of a small town, the closest point of civilization to Blackwood Ranch, Clara stepped onto the platform, her small trunk beside her. The air was dry and hot, smelling of horses and dust. Men in worn hats and rugged clothes moved purposefully, their faces tanned and weathered. This was the West, raw and untamed, just as she had imagined. A tall, wiry man, his face a web of sun-baked wrinkles, approached her cautiously. He wore a patched denim jacket and a broad-brimmed hat that shadowed his eyes. "Miss Evans?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "I'm Jed. Mr. Blackwood sent me." Clara managed a polite smile, though her heart pounded a little faster. "Yes, I am Clara Evans. It's a pleasure to meet you, Jed." Jed offered a small, awkward nod. "The pleasure's mine, ma'am. Mr. Blackwood's waiting." He led her to a waiting buckboard, a simple utilitarian wagon, a stark contrast to the elegant carriages of St. Louis. The ride to Blackwood Ranch was long and silent, broken only by the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the occasional snort from the horses. Jed, though polite, was not one for small talk. Clara absorbed the landscape, vast undulating plains stretching to the horizon, a sky so immense it made her feel tiny, insignificant. The beauty was stark, untamed and breathtaking. But beneath its grandeur, she sensed a harshness, a constant struggle for existence. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery oranges and deep purples, Jed pointed ahead. "That's Blackwood, ma'am." Clara followed his gaze. In the distance, silhouetted against the setting sun, stood a cluster of buildings, a farmhouse, a barn, corrals. It looked smaller than she had imagined, more isolated. A sense of apprehension, cold and sharp, pierced through her carefully constructed calm. This was it, her new home, her new life. She tried to conjure an image of Elias Blackwood, her unknown husband. Would he be kind, stern, resentful? The thought of marrying a stranger, of sharing her life with a man whose face she hadn't seen, was daunting. Yet she had chosen this path. She had sought a new beginning, and here it was, laid out before her on the dusty plains of the West. As the buckboard drew closer, she could make out details. The peeling paint on the farmhouse, the sag in the porch. It was clearly a working ranch, not a grand estate, but a home, nonetheless, and a chance. Clara took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had left St. Louis seeking more than just financial security. She sought purpose, independence, a place where she could truly make a difference. The West, with all its challenges, felt like a canvas waiting for her to paint her own story. She didn't know what kind of man Elias Blackwood was, or what awaited her at Blackwood Ranch, but she was ready to face it. She would not be merely an unwanted bride. She would be Clara Evans, and she would find her own way. The buckboard rumbled to a halt in front of the Blackwood farmhouse, kicking up a final cloud of dust that settled on everything. Elias stood on the porch, his arms crossed over his chest, a formidable figure silhouetted against the fading light. He watched Clara descend from the wagon, his gaze as cold and assessing as a winter wind. He saw a woman of slender build, dressed in practical but not unflattering traveling clothes, her posture surprisingly straight despite the long journey. Her hair, the color of burnished copper, was pulled back neatly, and her eyes, even from a distance, seemed to hold an unnerving, quiet strength. This was not the simpering, delicate lady he had envisioned. This was someone different, and that in itself unsettled him further. Clara, despite the fatigue of her journey, met his gaze directly. She had expected a gruff man, hardened by the West, but Elias Blackwood was more imposing than she had imagined. His eyes held a depth of sorrow and resentment that sent a shiver down her spine. He made no move to greet her, no word of welcome. His silence was as loud as a shout, clearly conveying his displeasure at her presence. Jed, sensing the tension, cleared his throat. "Mr. Blackwood, this here's Miss Evans." Elias merely nodded, a stiff, almost imperceptible movement. "Welcome to Blackwood, Miss Evans." His voice was low, devoid of warmth, each word a blunt declaration of fact rather than a greeting. Clara forced a small, polite smile. "Mr. Blackwood, thank you for sending Jed. The journey was eventful." She chose her words carefully, trying to project a calm she didn't entirely feel. He offered no reply, just continued to stare, his silence hanging heavy in the dusty air. It was clear he saw her as an obligation, a transaction, exactly as he had decided he would. The unspoken message was loud and clear. "You are not wanted here." "Jed, take her trunk inside," Elias finally commanded, his voice sharp. He then turned and walked into the house without another word, leaving Clara standing alone on the porch, the echoes of his unwelcome ringing in her ears. A wave of humiliation washed over Clara. She had anticipated a difficult reception, but not this outright disdain. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of her purpose, of her resolve. She had come here for a new life, and she wouldn't be deterred by a cold shoulder, no matter how imposing the man delivering it. Jed, looking apologetic, awkwardly carried her trunk inside. "Don't mind him, ma'am," he muttered, his voice lowered. "Mr. Blackwood's got his ways." Clara managed another small smile. "I understand, Jed. It's a big change for both of us." Inside, the house was as stark and unwelcoming as Elias's demeanor. The main room served as a living area, dining room, and, judging by the cot in the corner, Elias's sleeping quarters. A small, unadorned room off to the side, smelling faintly of cedar, was clearly intended for her. It contained a simple bed, a rough wooden dresser, and a small window looking out onto the parched landscape. "This will be your room, Miss Evans," Jed said, placing her trunk at the foot of the bed. "There's fresh water in the basin." "Thank you, Jed," Clara replied, genuinely grateful for his small act of kindness. "It's perfect." After Jed left, Clara stood in the center of her new room, the silence pressing in around her. The reality of her situation hit her with full force. She was here in the heart of the West, bound to a man who clearly resented her existence. A tear pricked at the corner of her eye, but she blinked it away fiercely. She would not cry. She would not let him see her weakness. She unpacked her few belongings, meticulously folding her dresses and placing her book of poetry on the dresser. Her mother's locket she kept around her neck, a tangible link to the past, a silent source of comfort. As she organized her things, she made a decision. She would not simply exist here. She would not be a burden. She would prove her worth. Later, Jed called her for supper. The meal was simple: tough beef stew and stale bread. Elias sat at the head of the table, eating in silence, his gaze fixed on his plate. Clara tried to make conversation, asking Jed about the ranch, the cattle, the challenges of the drought. Jed responded politely, his answers brief but informative. Elias remained silent, a stone wall between them. "The ranch seems very demanding," Clara ventured, hoping to draw Elias into the conversation. Elias finally looked up, his stormy eyes meeting hers. "It is." His voice was flat, dismissive. "This isn't St. Louis, Miss Evans. Life out here isn't for the faint of heart." Clara's jaw tightened slightly, but she kept her voice even. "I understand that, Mr. Blackwood. I am prepared for hard work." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Hard work is one thing. Surviving out here is another. This ranch barely feeds itself. You won't find silk and lace here, only dust and disappointment." His words were meant to wound, to push her away, but Clara felt a spark of defiance ignite within her. "Perhaps," she said, her voice steady, "but a home is more than silk and lace. It's about what you make of it." Elias merely grunted, returning his attention to his stew, effectively ending the conversation. Clara ate in silence, her resolve hardening with each of his dismissive remarks. He might not want her, but she was here, and she would not be driven away. She would not allow herself to be just an unwanted bride. She would find her place, or she would create one. That night, lying on the unfamiliar bed in her small room, Clara listened to the sounds of the ranch, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustling of the wind through the dry grass. She thought of Elias, of the deep-seated pain she glimpsed behind his harsh facade. He was a man consumed by his burdens, trapped by his past. She knew a little of what that felt like. A strange determination began to bloom in her heart. She wasn't here just to save herself from poverty or to fulfill an old pact. She was here, and perhaps, just perhaps, she could bring a little light into this bleak, dust-choked world. She didn't know how, but she would try. She would turn this unwanted union into something meaningful, not just for herself, but for the hardened man who seemed so desperate to push her away. The West was a challenge, and Elias Blackwood was perhaps the greatest challenge of all. The first few days at Blackwood Ranch were a test of Clara's resilience. Elias remained as distant and unapproachable as the horizon, his interactions limited to curt instructions or dismissive grunts. He spent his days in the fields, working from dawn till dusk, returning only for meals, which were eaten in a silence so profound it felt like a presence itself. Clara found herself largely left to her own devices, navigating the unfamiliar rhythms of ranch life. She quickly realized the extent of the ranch's struggles. The farmhouse, though sturdy, showed signs of neglect: a leaky roof in the kitchen, a broken shutter on the parlor window, dust seemingly ingrained into every surface. The garden, once productive, was now a patch of weeds and dry soil. The corrals needed repair, and the ranch hands, besides Jed, were few and overworked. Clara, however, was not one to sit idly by. She had always found solace and purpose in activity. After a morning of being largely ignored by Elias, and with Jed busy in the barns, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She found a broom in the corner of the kitchen and began sweeping, the rhythmic swish of the bristles a small rebellion against the pervasive stillness. Jed, returning for a moment, stopped short when he saw her. "What are you doing, ma'am?" he asked, surprised. "Cleaning," Clara replied, a determined glint in her eyes. "This house could use a good scrubbing, and perhaps," she added, eyeing the wilting plants outside, a bit of life brought back to it. Jed scratched his head. "Mr. Blackwood, he ain't one for fuss, ma'am." "Perhaps not," Clara said, "but I am. And this is my home now, too." And so began Clara's quiet campaign to transform Blackwood. She started with the kitchen, scrubbing away years of grime, mending torn curtains with her sewing kit, and even managing to fix a loose floorboard with a hammer she found in the barn. She discovered a small patch of hardy wildflowers growing near the creek and carefully transplanted them into an old ceramic jug, placing it on the kitchen table, a defiant splash of color against the drabness. Her efforts did not go unnoticed, though Elias said nothing. He would come home to a slightly cleaner house, a table set with surprising care, and the faint, unfamiliar scent of soap and fresh linen. He would merely glance at the changes, his expression unreadable, and continue with his silent meal. His silence was a shield, but Clara began to notice tiny cracks. One afternoon she ventured out to the dilapidated garden. The soil was hard-packed, riddled with rocks. She found an old spade and began to turn the earth, her soft hands quickly blistering. It was back-breaking work, but the thought of fresh vegetables, of bringing something living and thriving to this parched land, spurred her on. Elias rode in later, dismounting near the corrals. He watched her from a distance, her small figure bent over the earth, her hair escaping its pins and glinting in the sun. He couldn't deny her tenacity. Most women would have complained, demanded comforts. This one was digging in the dirt. He rode closer, his horse's hooves thudding softly. Clara looked up, her face streaked with dirt, a smudge on her cheek. She didn't flinch or look away, just wiped her brow with the back of her hand. "What are you doing out here, Miss Evans?" he asked, his voice still gruff, but with a faint edge of curiosity. "Trying to cultivate a garden, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her voice unwavering despite her weariness. "Perhaps some vegetables might alleviate the monotony of stew." He snorted. "Waste of time. The land won't yield anything this dry. It's stubborn. Perhaps it just needs a little encouragement," Clara countered, meeting his gaze directly. "And patience." Elias just stared at her, then turned his horse and rode off to the barn, leaving her once again in his silent wake. But Clara felt a small victory. He had spoken to her, however briefly, and he hadn't forbidden her efforts. Jed, on the other hand, was openly appreciative. He started leaving her buckets of water for the garden, found her a sturdier hoe, and even offered advice on what might grow in the dry soil. "You got a good way with things, ma'am," he said one evening, his eyes twinkling. "Things that need tendering to." Clara smiled. "Thank you, Jed. It's nice to feel useful." Her small acts of domesticity slowly began to chip away at the ranch's desolate atmosphere. She started baking bread, the aroma filling the house with a warmth it hadn't known in years. Elias, though he never commented, ate more heartily, and even Jed admitted it was a sight better than my own rock-hard efforts. One evening, As Elias sat at the table finishing his supper, Clara brought him a freshly baked apple pie, a rare treat she had managed to concoct from dried apples she found in the pantry. She placed it before him, a silent offering. He looked at the pie, then at her, his usual mask of indifference faltering for a fleeting moment. The aroma of cinnamon and baked apples filled the room, a stark contrast to the usual smells of dust and stale coffee. "I don't need charity, Miss Evans," he said, his voice low but without its usual bite. "It's not charity, Mr. Blackwood," Clara replied softly. "It's simply a pie." He said nothing more, but later, when Clara returned to the kitchen, a slice of the pie was gone. A tiny, almost imperceptible victory. Clara knew her efforts were small, perhaps insignificant in the face of Blackwood's overwhelming problems and Elias's entrenched bitterness. But she was planting seeds, both in the dry earth and, she hoped, in the hardened heart of her unwanted husband. She wouldn't force her way in, but she would certainly make her presence known. She would be an active part of this home, whether Elias Blackwood wanted to admit it or not. The West was teaching her resilience, and she was determined to prove that even a small act of kindness could slowly, painstakingly change everything. Elias Blackwood found himself increasingly disturbed by Clara's quiet presence. Her tireless efforts to bring order and a semblance of comfort to the run-down ranch house were like a persistent melody, interrupting his silent symphony of solitude. He couldn't ignore the cleaner floors, the freshly mended curtains, or the tantalizing scent of baking bread that now often drifted from the kitchen. It was an unwelcome intrusion, a constant reminder that his carefully constructed world of bleak isolation was slowly being eroded. He tried to ignore her, to maintain his wall of indifference, but it was growing harder. He caught glimpses of her working in the fledgling garden, her brow furrowed in concentration, her hands stained with earth. He saw her mending Jed's worn shirts by the light of an oil lamp, her needle moving with practiced precision. She was not the fragile, demanding woman he had braced himself for. She was something else entirely, resilient, resourceful, and undeniably kind. This kindness, this quiet competence grated on his nerves. It reminded him of things he had lost, of the warmth and light that had once filled Blackwood Ranch before grief and hardship had swept them away. Every small improvement she made felt like a subtle accusation, highlighting his own neglect, his surrender to the bleakness. One evening, as Elias was oiling his rifle by the hearth, Clara sat at the kitchen table, carefully patching a tear in Jed's work vest. The flickering lamplight cast long shadows across the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. "This ranch used to be different," Elias said abruptly, his voice rough, surprising himself as much as Clara. Clara looked up, her needle poised. "How so, Mr. Blackwood?" He hesitated, then continued, almost against his will. "My mother, she had a way with things. Made this place a home. Always flowers on the table, good food, laughter." His voice, for the first time, held a note of wistful tenderness. She loved this land, tried to make it bloom even when it fought back. Clara listened, her gaze soft. "She sounds like a wonderful woman." Elias grunted, shaking his head. She was. "But the West, it takes what it wants. She died young. Illness. The same year my father—" He trailed off, the words catching in his throat. The memory of his father's slow decline, his desperate last efforts to secure the ranch, the forced marriage pact, it all came rushing back, a torrent of old wounds. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Blackwood," Clara said quietly. "Losing family is a heavy burden." She understood. She carried her own grief, the quiet ache for her mother, the loss of the life they had shared. His eyes, dark and troubled, met hers across the room. He saw not pity, but understanding, a shared sorrow that unnerved him. He didn't want her understanding. He didn't want her sympathy. He wanted her to remain an outsider, a temporary fixture. "They're gone," he said, his voice flat, dismissing the emotion. "Just me now, and this ranch." Clara put down the vest. "You're not entirely alone, Mr. Blackwood. You have Jed, and you have me." His gaze hardened. "You are here out of obligation, Miss Evans. Nothing more. Let's not confuse a marriage pact with companionship." The words stung, but Clara held his gaze. "Perhaps the obligation can become something more, Mr. Blackwood, if we allow it to." He scoffed, turning back to his rifle. "Hope is a dangerous thing out here, Miss Evans. It'll get you killed." Clara watched him, a profound sadness settling over her. He was so deeply entrenched in his pain, so afraid to let anyone in. It wasn't just the physical hardships of the West that had hardened him, it was the ghosts of his past, the losses that haunted him. Later that week, a new challenge presented itself. One of the calves, a small sickly thing, was born weak and struggled to feed. Elias, pragmatic and hardened, had seen such things before. "It's not worth the effort, Jed," he'd said, his voice devoid of emotion. "It'll just die anyway." But Clara couldn't stand by. She remembered her own mother's frailness, her struggle against illness, and a deep well of compassion stirred within her. She spent hours in the barn, gently coaxing the calf to drink, warming milk for it by the fire. She named it Hope, a silent defiance against Elias's grim prognosis. Elias would see her, bent over the tiny calf, murmuring softly to it, her hands gentle as she wiped its muzzle. He saw the same tenacious spirit she brought to the garden, to the house. He saw her pouring her energy, her hope, into something he had already deemed lost. "You're wasting your time," he told her one evening, finding her still in the barn, her face smudged with dirt and concern. "Perhaps," Clara replied without looking up, "but I cannot stand by and watch something suffer if I can help it." Her words hit him with an unexpected force, echoing an old memory. His mother, nursing a wounded bird back to health, her hands gentle, her eyes filled with the same unwavering compassion. He quickly pushed the memory away, refusing to acknowledge the ache it caused. "It's a ranch, Miss Evans," he said, his voice clipped. "Not a hospital. Some things just aren't meant to survive." Clara finally looked up, her gaze steady. "Perhaps that's true, Mr. Blackwood, but perhaps some things just need a little more care than others to find their strength." He left the barn, leaving her to her futile efforts. But as he lay in his cot later that night, he could still hear the faint, high-pitched bleating of the calf, and perhaps the quiet, persistent murmuring of Clara's voice. She was not just tending to a dying animal, she was tending to a place, to a memory, to a spirit that he thought had long since died at Blackwood Ranch, and that, more than anything, threatened to break through the carefully constructed walls around his heart. The relentless sun beat down on Blackwood Ranch, baking the earth to a hard, cracked shell. The drought, already severe, deepened with each passing day, turning the landscape into a desolate canvas of browns and grays. The creek, once a lifeline, had dwindled to a muddy trickle, forcing Elias and Jed to spend hours hauling water from a deeper, more distant well. The cattle, their ribs showing through their coats, moved sluggishly, their hunger a constant low drone in the parched air. Elias's mood grew darker with the land. He was a man fighting a losing battle, and the desperation etched on his face grew more pronounced. The financial strain was immense, feed was scarce and expensive, and the market price for his emaciated cattle was plummeting. Silas Macready's offer to buy Blackwood, once merely an insult, now felt like a looming inevitability. Clara watched him, her heart aching for the burden he carried. She saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way his jaw was perpetually clenched. She knew his harshness was a shield, a manifestation of his fear and despair. She continued her quiet work, nurturing her small garden, keeping the house as clean and welcoming as possible, and most importantly, caring for the sickly calf she had named Hope. Hope, against all odds, was slowly gaining strength. Clara's persistent care had paid off. The calf, though still small, now stood on wobbly legs, its bleat stronger, its eyes brighter. It was a tiny miracle in a world that offered little hope. Elias, though he never acknowledged it directly, had stopped making cynical remarks about her efforts. He would sometimes pause at the barn door, watching her with the calf, a flicker of something unreadable in his stormy eyes, before he turned away. One sweltering afternoon, Jed returned from checking the fence lines, his face grim. "Found 3 more dead, Elias," he reported, his voice heavy. "The heat's getting to 'em, and the waterhole by Miller's Ridge is nearly dry." Elias slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing through the silent house. "Damn it all! What more can this land take?" His frustration was a raw, visceral thing consuming him. Clara, who was preparing their meager supper, flinched at the outburst, but did not cower. She had learned that his anger was not directed at her, but at the unforgiving circumstances that bound him. "Is there nothing more we can do?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Elias turned on her, his eyes blazing. "What do you suggest, Miss Evans? Pray for rain? Perform a miracle? We're out of options. The ranch is dying and there's nothing I can do to stop it." His words were sharp, meant to sting, to push her away from his despair. Clara met his gaze, unflinching. "We may not be able to control the rain, Mr. Blackwood, but we can control our response. There must be something. Perhaps new well sites, or trading for feed from further afield if it's available," he scoffed. "Do you think I haven't tried? The wells are deep, the ground's like rock, and feed. Macready's bought up most of what's available just to squeeze me out." The mention of Macready brought a fresh wave of tension. Clara had heard Jed speak of the man, and sensed the deep animosity between the two ranchers. "Then we must find other ways," Clara insisted, her mind racing. "There must be wild forage in the hills, or perhaps we can adapt our methods. Every life saved, every ounce of feed conserved makes a difference." Elias stared at her, genuinely surprised by her tenacity, by her refusal to be intimidated by his despair. Most people, faced with his bitterness and the reality of Blackwood, would have retreated. She stood firm, her gaze steady, her spirit unbroken. "You don't understand, Miss Evans," he said, his voice lower now, tinged with weariness. "This isn't just about feed and water. It's about a name, a legacy. My father made a promise, and I'm failing to keep it." Clara took a step closer. "And what if keeping that promise means finding new ways to survive? What if it means looking beyond the conventional, Mr. Blackwood? Your father's legacy isn't just about the land. It's about the spirit of the Blackwood name, the determination to endure." He turned away from her, running a hand through his hair. Her words, though laced with a wisdom he hadn't expected, stirred up a fresh wave of self-doubt. He was a rancher. He knew this land. What could a woman from St. Louis possibly teach him about survival here? Yet her persistence, her quiet strength, was undeniable. The little calf, Hope, was living proof of her unexpected ability to nurture life where he had seen only death. That night, as the air offered no relief from the heat, Elias found himself unable to sleep. He walked outside, the vast star-studded sky stretching above him, a silent observer to his turmoil. He saw a light still burning in the barn. He walked towards it, finding Clara there, meticulously patching a leak in a water trough with tar and cloth, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked up, startled, as he entered. "Still working?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. "Just trying to save every drop, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, wiping her hands on an old rag. "Every little bit helps, doesn't it?" He watched her, then picked up a spare bucket and started filling it from the well, adding it to the trough. He still had his doubts. His despair was deep-seated, but for the first time in a long time he didn't feel entirely alone in the fight. Her unwavering spirit, her refusal to give up, was a tiny spark in the encroaching darkness. He still considered her an unwanted bride, an obligation, but a new unsettling thought began to form in his mind. Perhaps, just perhaps, this unwanted bride might be exactly what Blackwood Ranch and he himself desperately needed. The drought continued, but something within Elias Blackwood, as arid as the land, seemed to stir, ever so slightly. The relentless heat broke with a fury that was almost as devastating as the drought itself. A sudden violent thunderstorm swept across the plains, bringing not the gentle, life-giving rain everyone prayed for, but a torrential downpour accompanied by fierce winds and blinding lightning. It was a storm of biblical proportions, threatening to undo the little progress Clara had painstakingly made. Elias and Jed worked frantically, trying to secure the barn and the livestock. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the roof of the shed, threatening to flatten anything in its path. Rain hammered against the windows of the farmhouse, transforming the dry earth into a sea of mud. Clara, inside the house, tried to keep calm. She stoked the fire, prepared hot coffee and gathered blankets, anticipating the cold and exhaustion of the men. Her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and determination. This was the West, in all its unforgiving glory, and she was learning its brutal lessons quickly. Suddenly a crashing sound from the barn cut through the roar of the storm. Elias, who had just come in to grab a hammer, instantly knew what it was. "The north wall!" he yelled, grabbing his oilskins. The wind must have taken it. He and Jed rushed back into the tempest, their figures swallowed by the driving rain. Clara, despite the danger, couldn't stay behind. She grabbed a lantern, shielding its flame with her body, and followed them, her skirts quickly becoming heavy with mud. The scene in the barn was chaotic. Part of the north wall had indeed collapsed, leaving a gaping hole. Inside, the cattle were panicked, bellowing in fear, some trying to push through the opening. One of the newer calves, separated from its mother, had stumbled and was trapped beneath a fallen beam, its cries faint against the storm. It was Hope. "Jed, help me brace this!" Elias shouted, struggling to hold up a swaying section of the remaining wall. He saw the trapped calf, but his immediate priority was to prevent further collapse and save the rest of the herd. Clara, however, saw only the tiny, struggling calf. Hope, her little miracle, was in danger. Without a moment's hesitation, she dropped the lantern and scrambled over the debris, ignoring the sharp edges of broken wood and the thrashing hooves of the terrified cattle. "Clara, no! Get back!" Elias yelled, his voice laced with uncharacteristic fear for her. He watched in a mixture of horror and awe as she crawled towards the trapped calf, her small hands reaching out to it. The beam was heavy, pressing down on the calf's leg. Clara, fueled by adrenaline, tried to lift it, grunting with effort, but it wouldn't budge. She could see the fear in Hope's eyes, the desperate struggle. "Jed! The calf!" Elias roared, realizing her desperate intent. He couldn't leave the wall, but he couldn't let her face this alone. Jed, seeing Clara's plight, quickly moved to her side, grunting as he strained to lift the beam. Together, their combined strength was enough. The beam shifted, just enough. Clara gently pulled Hope free, cradling the shivering animal in her arms. As she carried the calf away from the danger, she stumbled, falling into the mud. But she held Hope close, protecting it from the fall, her own body taking the brunt of the impact. Elias, having secured the wall with Jed's help, rushed to her side, his heart pounding in his chest. "Clara, are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough with a concern he rarely showed. He knelt beside her, his hands surprisingly gentle as he checked her for injuries. She was covered in mud, her hair plastered to her face, a scrape on her cheek bleeding faintly. But her eyes, though wide with the aftermath of fear, held a triumphant sparkle. "I'm fine, Mr. Blackwood," she gasped. "Hope is safe." He stared at her, then at the calf she still clutched to her chest. He saw not the delicate Eastern lady he had envisioned, but a woman of immense courage, fierce compassion, and an unwavering spirit. She had put herself in danger, risked her own safety, for a creature he had deemed worthless. "You're a fool, Clara," he muttered. But there was no anger in his voice, only a profound bewilderment, and something else he couldn't name. He helped her to her feet, his arm steadying her, and for a fleeting moment her body leaned into his, a shared warmth amidst the storm. They managed to stabilize the barn as the storm slowly began to subside, leaving behind a drenched, muddy landscape. Back in the house, by the warmth of the fire, Clara tended to Hope, cleaning its small leg and wrapping it in a warm blanket. Elias watched her, a silent observer. Later, as Jed went to bed utterly exhausted, Elias found Clara still awake, nursing a cup of coffee, the calf sleeping peacefully at her feet. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, breaking the silence. "You could have been seriously hurt." Clara looked up, her gaze tired but steady. "Perhaps, but I couldn't let it die, Mr. Blackwood, not after all the effort we put into it." He sat down opposite her, the firelight dancing across his rugged face. "Why, Clara?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Why do you care so much? It's just a calf, there'll be others." Clara took a sip of her coffee. "Because every life has value, Mr. Blackwood, and because sometimes the smallest spark of hope is the most important thing to protect, especially when everything else feels lost." Her words resonated with him, piercing through the layers of his cynicism. He thought of his own despair, his own feeling of being lost. He thought of his father's dying wish, the promise he was struggling to keep, and he saw Clara, this unwanted bride, bringing not just hope to a calf, but perhaps a flicker of it to him. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he saw not an obligation, not an intruder, but a rescuer, an angel in the storm, bringing light and warmth to a world he had allowed to become cold and dark. The walls around his heart, battered by the storm, seemed to crack a little further, letting in a sliver of something new, something dangerously close to admiration. The days following the storm brought a fragile peace to Blackwood Ranch. The torrential rain had, surprisingly, soaked into the parched earth enough to offer a temporary reprieve from the drought's harshest grip. The creeks flowed a little fuller, and the dusty fields held a hint of dampness. The barn, though damaged, was secured, and the cattle, though still lean, seemed less restless. And Hope, the calf, was recovering, trotting on its mended leg, a living testament to Clara's unwavering care. Elias's demeanor, too, had undergone a subtle shift. The hard edges around his eyes seemed to soften, and his silences, though still frequent, felt less like a wall and more like a quiet contemplation. He no longer dismissed Clara's efforts, and occasionally he would even offer a brief, almost reluctant word of appreciation. One morning, he found Clara out in her small garden, tending to the struggling plants. The storm had wreaked havoc, but she was meticulously replanting, fortifying the rows and clearing debris. "Looks like a fight out here," he observed, leaning against the fence, his arms crossed. Clara smiled faintly, wiping dirt from her cheek. A battle, perhaps, but not a lost one. "A little resilience goes a long way." Elias grunted, a sound that was no longer dismissive but almost thoughtful. He watched her for a moment. Then, without a word, he fetched a shovel and began to help her, turning over a patch of stubborn earth, breaking up the clods of dirt. Clara paused, genuinely surprised. "Mr. Blackwood, you don't have to—" "It's my ranch, Miss Evans," he interrupted, his voice gruff, but his actions speaking louder than words, "and a garden could do us some good." They worked in a shared silence, the rhythm of their shovels and hoes a quiet symphony. It was the first time they had truly worked side by side, sharing a common purpose that went beyond the unspoken obligation of their marriage. Clara felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of quiet triumph. He was letting her in, little by little. Over the next few days, these small moments of connection began to accumulate. Elias would find an extra bucket of fresh water for her garden without being asked. He would bring her interesting rocks or pieces of driftwood he found on his rides, leaving them anonymously on the porch, knowing she appreciated simple beauty. He even started to acknowledge hope, giving the calf a rough but affectionate scratch behind the ears when he thought no one was looking. Clara, in turn, began to see beyond Elias's hardened exterior. She saw the deep love he held for the land, despite his constant battles with it. She saw his quiet competence, his tireless work ethic, and the immense pressure he carried. She understood that his gruffness was a shield, protecting a heart that had been wounded too many times. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Jed having long since retired, Clara noticed Elias staring into the flames, a faraway look in his eyes. "You miss your family, don't you?" she asked softly, intuitively. He stiffened, then slowly relaxed. "More than I care to admit," he confessed, his voice low. "My mother, she was the heart of this place, and my father, he built it from nothing, left it to me with a mountain of debt and a promise." "The marriage pact," Clara said, her voice understanding. He nodded, not looking at her. "He thought it would save the ranch, unite us with a family of means. I saw it as a desperate act, and you, as an unwanted obligation." He finally looked at her, his eyes holding a flicker of something close to regret. Clara met his gaze. "I understand why you felt that way, Mr. Blackwood. I truly do, but perhaps sometimes the unexpected can be a blessing." He didn't reply, just stared into the fire, but a subtle change had occurred. The wall between them, though still present, felt thinner, more permeable. He hadn't apologized for his initial harshness, but his quiet honesty, his subtle gestures of acceptance, spoke volumes. She decided to take a chance. "Elias," she said, using his first name for the first time, the sound feeling both foreign and natural on her tongue. "There are ways to improve the ranch, even with what we have. We could try rotational grazing, perhaps plant some drought-resistant feed in that far pasture. I've read about it." He looked at her, a hint of surprise in his eyes. "You've read about ranching?" "I've read a great deal," she replied, a small smile playing on her lips. "I may be from the East, but I'm not entirely ignorant of the world beyond St. Louis. My father was a scholar, and he believed knowledge was to be sought wherever it could be found." Elias was silent for a long moment, considering her words. The idea of taking advice from her, an Eastern woman, initially seemed absurd, but then he remembered her tenacity in the garden, her courage during the storm, and the unwavering life force of the calf, Hope. Perhaps she did see things he couldn't, blinded as he was by his own despair and conventional thinking. "Show me," he finally said, his voice gruff, but with an underlying curiosity. "Show me what you mean." Clara's heart swelled with a quiet joy. It was a small step, but a significant one. An unspoken bond was beginning to form between them, woven from shared hardships, quiet understanding, and the fragile tendrils of hope she was so determined to cultivate. The unwanted bride was slowly, painstakingly beginning to find her place, not just in the house but in the life of the hardened rancher, and in the very fabric of Blackwood Ranch itself. With Elias's reluctant but genuine invitation, Clara eagerly embraced the opportunity to contribute more actively to the ranch. Her quiet research, meticulously gathered from old farming almanacs and books on agriculture she'd carefully packed, proved invaluable. She spent hours explaining the principles of rotational grazing, demonstrating how moving the cattle regularly could allow pastures to recover, even in dry conditions. Elias, initially skeptical, listened with a critical ear, but also with an open mind he hadn't possessed weeks ago. He watched her draw diagrams in the dust with a stick, her explanations clear and logical. Jed, ever practical, was quicker to see the sense in her ideas. "Might just work, boss," he'd said, nodding thoughtfully. "We ain't got much to lose." And so, under Clara's guidance and with Elias's grudging cooperation, they began to implement changes. They spent days repairing old fences, building temporary enclosures, and moving the cattle to fresh pastures. It was hard, dusty work, but there was a new sense of purpose in the air, a shared endeavor that slowly began to bridge the gap between Elias and Clara. Working side by side, they learned to communicate, not just through words but through shared glances, understanding nods, and the rhythmic movements of their labor. Elias, initially reserved, found himself explaining the nuances of the land, pointing out specific grasses, and sharing stories of his father's ranching days. Clara, in turn, listened intently, soaking up the practical knowledge of the West. One afternoon, as they were repairing a fence line, the sun beating down relentlessly, Elias paused, wiping sweat from his brow with his forearm. He looked at Clara, who, despite her smaller stature, was straining to pull a taut wire, her face smudged with dirt, a determined frown on her lips. "You're not afraid of work, are you, Miss Evans?" he observed, a hint of genuine admiration in his voice. Clara let go of the wire, catching her breath. "No, Mr. Blackwood. I believe in working for what one wants, and I want to see this ranch thrive." She met his gaze, her eyes earnest. He nodded slowly. "My father, he always said the land tells you what it needs. You just gotta listen." He gestured to the newly fenced pasture, already showing signs of rest. "Looks like you're listening pretty well." It was the closest thing to a compliment he had ever offered, and Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you, Elias," she replied, her voice soft. The use of his first name felt natural now, a sign of their evolving connection. He didn't flinch, didn't correct her. He simply returned to his work, but the atmosphere between them had shifted further, growing warmer, more accepting. The changes weren't immediate, but slowly, subtly, the ranch began to respond. The cattle, though still thin, seemed to graze with renewed vigor in the rested pastures. Clara's small garden, against all odds, began to sprout tiny green shoots, lettuce, beans, and hardy root vegetables. It was a tangible sign that with care and persistence, even the most barren land could yield life. One evening, as they sat down for supper, the aroma of Clara's freshly baked bread filling the air, Elias surprised them both by initiating a conversation. He spoke of the challenges he faced with local suppliers, the unfair prices he was forced to pay. Clara listened thoughtfully. "Perhaps," she suggested, "we could explore other suppliers, or even consider selling some of our wool directly at the nearest town market, rather than relying solely on the cattle buyers." Elias looked at her, his eyes narrowed in thought. "Direct sales? I hadn't considered it. Always dealt with the same buyers. It's how things are done." "Perhaps it's time to do things differently, Elias," Clara said gently. "The world is changing, and we must adapt to survive." Her words resonated with him. He had been so set in his ways, so bound by tradition and his own despair, that he hadn't allowed himself to see new possibilities. Clara, with her fresh perspective and unwavering belief, was slowly opening his eyes. Later that night, as Clara was preparing for bed, she heard a soft knock on her door. It was Elias. He stood there awkwardly, a piece of paper in his hand. "Found this in my father's old desk," he said, his voice a little gruff. "Maps. Old claim maps. Thought you might want to look at them, see if there are any unclaimed water sources further north." Clara took the maps, her fingers brushing against his. The brief touch sent a jolt through her, a small spark of something unexpected. "Thank you, Elias," she said, her voice a little breathless. "I'll study them." He nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than usual, Then he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the doorway, clutching the old maps. As she lay in bed, studying the faded lines and symbols on the maps, Clara felt a deep sense of contentment. She was no longer just an unwanted bride. She was a partner, a collaborator, a source of new ideas. Elias was slowly, painstakingly, beginning to trust her, to rely on her. The seeds of change planted amidst the dust and despair were beginning to take root, promising a future that only weeks ago had seemed utterly impossible. The journey ahead was still long, filled with unknown challenges, but for the first time Clara felt a true sense of belonging at Blackwood Ranch, and a quiet hope for the man who was slowly letting her into his guarded world. The fragile peace at Blackwood Ranch was a delicate bloom, susceptible to the harsh winds of the West. Clara's efforts, Elias's cautious engagement, and the gradual improvement of the land had created an atmosphere of tentative hope. Yet the shadow of Silas Macready loomed large, a constant reminder of the precariousness of their situation. Silas, a man whose ambition was matched only by his ruthlessness, was not one to stand idly by while his potential acquisition seemed to be mending itself. He had heard rumors, whispers of Clara's involvement, of Elias's surprising openness to her ideas, of a renewed spirit at Blackwood. This development did not sit well with him. He had anticipated Elias's ruin, his eventual surrender to debt and despair. Clara's presence was an unexpected complication, a variable he hadn't accounted for. One dusty afternoon, as Elias was inspecting the newly repaired fences, Silas rode up to the boundary, a smug smile plastered on his face. His horse, a magnificent black stallion, exuded an air of opulence that contrasted sharply with Elias's worn-out mare. "Elias," Silas called out, his voice dripping with false cordiality. "Heard you've been having some good fortune lately. The rains, I presume?" Elias straightened, his jaw tightening. He knew Silas's good fortune always came at someone else's expense. "Just making the best of what we have, Silas." Silas chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Making the best of it, are we? Or is it that pretty little wife of yours lending a hand? I hear she's quite the manager. Almost makes me wish I had an unwanted bride to help me run my own spread." His eyes, sharp and predatory, scanned the ranch, as if searching for weaknesses. Elias's gaze hardened. "My wife is none of your concern, Silas, and Blackwood is not for sale." "Not yet, perhaps," Silas countered, his smile widening. "But debts have a way of catching up, Elias, especially when one is distracted. This improvement you're making, it's all temporary. A few dry spells, a bad season, and you'll be back where you started. Or worse." He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Elias, does she know the true extent of your father's debts? Does she know that this marriage pact was as much about saving your skin as it was about fulfilling an old promise?" The words struck a raw nerve. Elias knew Clara understood the financial straits of the ranch, but he had deliberately shielded her from the full, crushing weight of his father's financial recklessness. The thought of Silas revealing that truth, of shattering the trust they were slowly building, filled him with a cold dread. "You know nothing about it, Silas," Elias said, his voice dangerously low. "Oh, but I do," Silas purred, enjoying Elias's discomfort. "I have my sources, and I predict that soon your angel will realize she's married to a sinking ship. And when that happens, Elias, she might just do what's best for her own survival. And that might involve finding a man who can offer her more security than you can." He let the insinuation hang in the air, a venomous seed planted in the fertile ground of Elias's insecurities. Silas rode off, leaving Elias standing alone, the wind whipping dust around him, echoing Silas's cruel words. That evening the atmosphere at the dinner table was strained. Elias was withdrawn, his usual stoicism replaced by a brooding silence. Clara, sensing his unease, tried to draw him out, but he remained distant, his answers curt. Later, after Jed had gone to bed, Clara approached Elias as he stared out the window at the darkening plains. "Elias," she began softly, "is something bothering you? You've been quiet all evening." He turned, his gaze troubled. Silas Macready was here today. Clara's expression tightened. She had heard Jed speak of Macready, the rival rancher, a man known for his greed and his constant attempts to acquire Blackwood Ranch. He said he knows about the debts," Elias continued, his voice strained. "He implied that perhaps you didn't know the full extent of things. and that if you did, you might reconsider your position here. Clara's eyes widened, not with fear, but with a quiet anger. He said that? Her voice was steady, but the undercurrent of steel was unmistakable. He thinks I'm easily swayed, or that I'm ignorant of the realities of this ranch. Elias looked at her, searching her face for any sign of doubt, any flicker of betrayal. He saw only resolve. He thinks you'll leave me, Clara, that you'll realize you're married to a losing venture. Clara stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. Elias, she said, her voice firm and clear, I came here knowing this ranch was struggling. I saw the drought, the worn-out land, the gaunt cattle. I didn't come here expecting riches or comfort. I came here because of a promise, yes, but also because I believed in the possibility of rebuilding, of making something new from what was broken. And I believe in you. She reached out, her hand gently touching his arm. Silas Macready can spread his whispers and plant his seeds of doubt, but they will not take root here, not with me. I am not an unwanted bride who will flee at the first sign of trouble. I am your wife, and this ranch is my home now. We will face the challenges together. Whatever the debts, whatever the hardships, we will face them together. Elias looked into her eyes, seeing the unwavering sincerity, the quiet strength that had so surprised him. He had braced himself for her to question him, to doubt him, perhaps even to retreat. Instead, she offered him her unwavering support, her belief. A wave of emotion, raw and potent, washed over him. Relief, gratitude, and a deep, burgeoning affection he had long suppressed. He covered her hand with his own, his thumb gently stroking her skin. The touch was electric, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken bond that was growing between them, a bond far stronger than any marriage pact or financial obligation. Silas Macready had tried to sow discord, but he had only succeeded in strengthening the very foundation he sought to undermine. In Clara's unwavering faith, Elias found not just a partner but an anchor, a beacon of hope in the turbulent West. The whispers of doubt had been silenced, replaced by the quiet certainty of their shared future. The threat of Silas Macready's interference, though momentarily blunted by Clara's resolute faith, was a persistent gnawing worry. Elias knew Silas would not give up easily. He was a man who saw opportunity in every crisis, and he viewed Blackwood Ranch as a prize ripe for the taking. The encroaching financial strain, exacerbated by the lingering effects of the drought and the costs of repairs and new initiatives, began to press down on Elias once more. He had hoped that their recent improvements and the promise of better grazing would be enough, but the debts his father had accrued were a relentless tide, threatening to pull him under. One crisp autumn morning, a formal letter arrived, delivered by a somber-faced lawyer from the nearest town. Elias opened it with a sense of foreboding. The letter detailed the overdue payments, the creditor's impatience, and the inevitable consequence. Foreclosure proceedings were being initiated. The ranch, his father's legacy, his own hard-won sanctuary, was to be put up for auction. Elias read the letter 3 times, the words blurring before his eyes. Foreclosure. The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones, a familiar enemy he thought he had finally begun to defeat. He looked at Clara, who was calmly mending a torn shirt, her brow furrowed in concentration. How could he tell her? How could he shatter the fragile hope she had so carefully nurtured? He walked out of the house, needing air, needing space to grapple with this devastating blow. He found Jed by the corrals, his face etched with concern. "Bad news, Elias?" Jed asked, his voice low. Elias simply handed him the letter. Jed read it, his weathered face paling. "Auction? They can't do this. Not after all you've done." "The law is the law, Jed," Elias said, his voice hollow. "My father was too proud, too foolish to manage his finances. He made promises he couldn't keep." The news spread through the small ranch like wildfire. The few remaining ranch hands, loyal though they were, looked at Elias with a mixture of pity and concern. The possibility of losing their livelihoods, their home, hung heavy in the air. Clara, upon reading the letter, did not cry or despair. She looked at Elias, her honey-colored eyes filled with a quiet determination. "An auction," she said, her voice steady. "When is it scheduled?" Elias gestured vaguely. "A month from now. Not enough time. Not nearly enough." "There is always enough time if we are resourceful," Clara replied. She walked over to the worn map of the ranch Elias had been studying, tracing the outer boundaries. "This land is valuable, Elias. It has potential. Macready wants it, doesn't he?" Elias nodded grimly. "He's been circling like a vulture for years." "Then perhaps we need to make him pay for it," Clara said, a glint in her eyes. "Not just for the land, but for the trouble he's caused. We can't afford to buy it back ourselves, not now. But maybe we can make it so expensive for him that he'll reconsider." Elias looked at her, intrigued despite his despair. "How do you propose we do that?" "We work," Clara stated, her voice firm. "We work harder than we ever have. We improve everything we can. We make Blackwood Ranch so undeniably valuable, so full of potential, that Silas Macready will have to pay a premium. And we rally support. There are other ranchers, aren't there? People who have also felt Macready's pressure." Over the next few weeks, Clara became a whirlwind of activity. She organized the ranch hands, assigning tasks with an efficiency that impressed Elias. They repaired every fence, mended every building, and cleared every neglected corner. Clara, with her knack for making things beautiful, even managed to coax her small garden into producing a surprisingly abundant harvest. She insisted on using the produce to make preserves and baked goods, creating a visible sign of Blackwood's renewed vitality. She also began to write letters, to distant relatives, to old acquaintances of her father, even to the local newspaper, subtly highlighting the plight of the Blackwood Ranch and the predatory tactics of Silas Macready. She framed the impending auction not as a defeat, but as a challenge to the community, a stand against a monopolistic bully. Elias, invigorated by Clara's tireless energy and unwavering optimism, threw himself into the work with a ferocity he hadn't felt in years. He oversaw the cattle, ensuring they were as well fed and healthy as possible, and worked alongside the hands, his leadership undeniable. He saw the hope return to their faces, the renewed sense of purpose. They were fighting for their home, for their livelihoods. The day of the auction arrived, a clear, crisp autumn day. A crowd of people had gathered, local ranchers, land speculators, and curious onlookers. Silas Macready was there, of course, his smug confidence radiating through the crowd. He had clearly expected Elias to be a broken man, defeated and alone. Instead, he saw Elias standing tall and resolute, with Clara by his side, her expression calm and determined. The ranch house looked cleaner, the corrals more secure, and even the cattle, though still recovering, appeared healthier than they had in years. Silas's smugness began to falter, replaced by a flicker of unease. The auctioneer began, his voice booming across the assembled crowd. Elias listened, his heart pounding as the bidding started. Silas, as expected, was the first to make an offer, his bid low, an insult to the land's true worth. But then, to Silas's astonishment and Elias's profound relief, a voice from the crowd spoke up. "I'll raise that by $500. It was old Jed, his face set in a determined expression, his life savings, meager as they were, offered in a desperate bid to save their home. A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Then another voice, a neighboring rancher Clara had corresponded with, spoke up. $7,000! Silas, his face darkening, was forced to bid higher. Elias watched, a mixture of awe and gratitude washing over him as the bidding escalated, fueled by the quiet support Clara had cultivated. Silas, accustomed to bullying his way through transactions, found himself in an unexpected bidding war. He had wanted Blackwood Ranch cheaply, but now, with the community rallying, the price was climbing far beyond his initial calculations. The whispers of doubt Silas had tried to sow had instead forged a united front. Elias, with Clara by his side, was no longer fighting alone. The auction had been a testament to Clara's strategic brilliance and the burgeoning community spirit she had fostered. While Elias watched with a mixture of relief and stunned disbelief, the bidding war Silas Macready had inadvertently ignited had driven the price of Blackwood Ranch to a level he was clearly unwilling to meet. The auctioneer, after several tense rounds, had finally called the sale, the hammer falling not to Silas but to a consortium of local ranchers, acting on behalf of Elias and Clara. The immediate threat of foreclosure had been averted, but the cost was substantial, a debt that now rested heavily on Elias and Clara. They had secured the ranch, but the struggle for survival was far from over. The relief of the moment was tempered by the sobering reality of their financial obligations. Silas Macready, his face a mask of barely concealed fury, had stormed away from the auction, his predatory gaze fixed on Elias and Clara with renewed malice. He would not forget this humiliation. Back at the ranch, a hushed celebration was underway. The ranch hands, their faces alight with relief, shared bottles of whiskey and hearty congratulations. Elias, still somewhat dazed, found himself caught in a bear hug from Jed. "We did it, boss. We kept Blackwood," Jed exclaimed, his voice thick with emotion. Elias clapped him on the shoulder, a genuine smile finally gracing his lips. "We did, Jed. Thanks to all of you. And thanks to Clara." He looked over at Clara, who was modestly accepting the praise from the other ranchers, her cheeks flushed with a mixture of pride and humility. Later that evening, after the ranch hands had dispersed, Elias and Clara sat by the dying embers of the fire. The silence between them was no longer tense but comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. "I owe you everything, Clara," Elias said, his voice rough with emotion. I never believed we could win, especially not against Silas." Clara reached across the small table, her hand covering his. "We won because we fought together, Elias, and because people believed in our cause. Your father's legacy, the hard work you've put in, it all mattered." She squeezed his hand. "And the fact that you let me help, that meant everything." He turned his hand, lacing his fingers with hers. Her touch was a comfort, a warmth that seeped into his soul, chasing away the last vestiges of his isolation. "I was a fool to underestimate you," he admitted, his gaze earnest. "Silas tried to sow doubt, and for a moment I let him. But you proved him wrong. You proved me wrong. We are a team now, Elias," Clara said softly. "And together we will make Blackwood thrive. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but we'll face it." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity, driven by the need to honor the new financial agreements and to begin repaying the consortium of ranchers who had supported them. Clara, with her sharp mind for business, helped Elias meticulously plan their finances, identifying areas where they could cut costs and maximize profits. They focused on improving the quality of their wool, diversifying their income streams, and ensuring their cattle were in prime condition for the next market. Elias, now fully embracing Clara's input, worked tirelessly alongside her. He found himself actually enjoying their shared projects, the collaborative problem-solving, the quiet satisfaction of seeing their plans come to fruition. He began to see the ranch not just as a burden, but as a shared venture, a testament to their combined strength. One afternoon, as they were discussing the best way to market their wool, Silas McCready rode by again, his face still etched with resentment. He stopped at the boundary, his eyes narrowing as he observed the activity on the ranch, the repaired fences, the healthy cattle, the general air of renewed purpose. "Fancy seeing you still here, Elias," Silas sneered, his voice laced with bitterness. "Thought you'd be packing your bags by now." Elias met his gaze, no longer intimidated, but with a quiet confidence that surprised even himself. "Blackwood is here to stay, Silas, and it's stronger than ever." Clara stepped forward, her expression calm but firm. "Mr. McCready, we may have secured the ranch, but we are still in your debt. We will be making our payments promptly, and we will not be a burden to anyone." Silas scoffed. "We'll see about that. Debts have a way of piling up, especially for those who aren't accustomed to managing them." He turned his horse. "Enjoy it while it lasts, Elias. The West has a way of humbling men." He rode off, his threat hanging in the air, but it no longer held the same power over Elias. Elias looked at Clara, a smile playing on his lips. "He doesn't like seeing us succeed, does he?" Clara chuckled. "Perhaps he's realizing that the unwanted bride and the broken rancher are a harder bargain than he anticipated." Elias's smile widened, and he reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. Her skin was soft, warm. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the resilience in her spirit, and the deep, unwavering love she had somehow found for him, for Blackwood Ranch. The marriage pact, once a symbol of desperation, had become the foundation of a partnership, a bond forged in shared hardship and mutual respect. He was no longer an isolated, broken man. He was a husband, a partner, and a rancher fighting for his future, with Clara by his side. The financial stability brought by the successful auction and Clara's shrewd management allowed Elias and Clara to breathe a little easier. The immediate threat of foreclosure had receded, replaced by the steady, demanding work of rebuilding and maintaining Blackwood Ranch. Yet the past, like the persistent dust of the plains, refused to be entirely swept away. Elias found himself increasingly drawn to his father's old study, a room that had remained largely untouched since his father's death. It was a space filled with the lingering presence of the man who had shaped Elias's life, both through his ambition and his ultimate failings. He'd avoided it for years, the memories too painful, the sense of responsibility too overwhelming. But now, with Clara's quiet encouragement, he began to sift through the papers, the journals, the accumulated remnants of his father's life. One afternoon, Clara found him poring over a stack of old letters, his brow furrowed. She brought him a cup of coffee, placing it gently beside him. "Anything interesting?" she asked, her voice soft. Elias looked up, his eyes tired but thoughtful. "My father, he was a dreamer, a man with grand visions but not much patience for the details. These letters, they're from creditors, from banks. He borrowed heavily, always convinced the next season, the next big sale would solve everything." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "He wanted so much for this ranch, for me. He didn't know how to achieve it without risking everything." Clara sat beside him, her presence a silent comfort. "He made a promise, Elias, to his friend, to secure the future of both families. Perhaps he saw this marriage pact as the only way out of his own financial mess. A desperate gamble. A gamble that nearly cost me everything," Elias murmured, but the bitterness in his voice was softened by a dawning understanding. He was beginning to see his father not just as the man who had left him a legacy of debt, but as a flawed human being, driven by a desire to provide, even if his methods were ultimately disastrous. As they sorted through the papers, they discovered more than just financial records. They found Elias's father's original ranch plans, detailed sketches of irrigation systems and expansion projects that had never been realized. They unearthed his mother's delicate watercolor paintings of the prairie wildflowers, vibrant and alive, a stark contrast to the parched landscape. They even found a small, locked wooden box, its contents a mystery. "What do you think is in here?" Clara asked, turning the box over in her hands. Elias shrugged. "No idea. Never saw it before." Together they managed to pry it open. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, were a few pieces of delicate old-fashioned jewelry, a locket, a pearl necklace, a pair of emerald earrings, and a single dried rose, its petals fragile and tinged with age. "My mother's," Elias breathed, picking up the locket. He opened it, revealing a miniature portrait of a beautiful young woman with kind eyes. His mother. I don't remember these." Clara gently touched the pearl necklace. Perhaps he kept them safe, a reminder of what he cherished most. Even amidst all his struggles, he held on to these. The discovery of these personal mementos seemed to unlock something in Elias. He began to speak more openly about his parents, sharing fragmented memories, the laughter and the sorrow intertwined. Clara listened, her empathy a soothing balm, her own past losses allowing her to connect with his grief. Inspired by his father's original plans and his mother's love for the land's natural beauty, Elias and Clara began to envision a new future for Blackwood Ranch. Clara's practical management skills, combined with Elias's growing understanding of his father's vision, started to merge. They discussed implementing a more sustainable irrigation system, utilizing the water from the northern well they had discovered. They talked about expanding the flower gardens, not just for beauty, but for the potential to sell bouquets and wildflower seeds in town. "Your father wanted to build something lasting, Elias," Clara said one evening, tracing the lines on an old blueprint. "He just lost his way in the process, but we can honor his vision. We can build something even better." Elias looked at her, his heart full. She had come to him as an obligation, an unwanted bride, but she had become so much more. She was his partner, his confidant, the keeper of his hopes. "With you here, Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I believe we can." The past was no longer a burden, but a foundation. The discovery of his parents' belongings, the shared exploration of his father's dreams, had not only brought Elias a sense of closure, but had also ignited a new passion within him. Blackwood Ranch was no longer just about survival. It was about growth, about building a legacy that honored both the past and the promise of the future, a future he now faced with a lightness in his heart he hadn't known was possible. As autumn deepened, painting the plains in hues of gold and crimson, a sense of cautious optimism settled over Blackwood Ranch. The new irrigation systems were being installed, the pastures were recovering, and Clara's wildflower gardens were beginning to bloom, attracting the attention of townsfolk and even some passing travelers. Elias and Clara, their bond strengthened by shared purpose and a deeper understanding, worked in tandem, their efforts a quiet testament to resilience and the power of partnership. However, the tranquility was fragile, and the shadow of Silas Macready continued to lengthen. Silas, having been outmaneuvered at the auction, was not one to accept defeat. He watched Blackwood's slow but steady recovery with a gnawing resentment. He saw Elias and Clara working together, saw the improvements they were making, and felt his own ambitions slipping through his fingers. He needed a way to regain the upper hand, to disrupt the burgeoning harmony at Blackwood. His opportunity came in the form of a sudden, unexpected blight that swept through the region's wheat crops. The farms closest to Blackwood, including Elias's own small wheat field, were hit particularly hard. The stalks withered, the grain turned black, and the hopes of a decent harvest began to crumble. "It's bad, Elias," Jed reported one evening, his face grim as he examined a blighted stalk. "Worse than anything I've seen. This black rust, they call it, spreads like wildfire." Elias felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in his stomach. This was a blow they could ill afford. Their reliance on cattle was significant, but the wheat crop was meant to provide a crucial supplementary income, a buffer against unexpected expenses. Now, that buffer was disappearing. Clara, though disheartened by the sight of the dying crops, remained outwardly calm. She had read about agricultural blights in her father's books and knew that swift, decisive action was crucial. "We need to act quickly," she told Elias and Jed. "We need to isolate the affected areas, destroy the blighted crops before it spreads further, and we need to look for alternative sources of income, immediately." Elias, though weary from the constant battles, found strength in Clara's pragmatic approach. "What alternatives are you thinking of?" "Our wool is of good quality now," Clara explained, "and the wildflowers. Perhaps we can focus on expanding those. We could also explore selling dried herbs. I've been experimenting with some, and they seem quite potent." Silas, however, had no intention of letting them find alternative solutions. He saw the blight not as a natural disaster, but as a weapon. He began to spread rumors in town, subtly at first, then more overtly. He spoke of Elias's financial instability, of the precariousness of the Blackwood ranch. He hinted that the blight was a sign of the land's inherent weakness, that Elias was incapable of managing it properly. "He's trying to undermine us," Elias said to Clara one evening, his voice tight with anger after hearing yet another of Silas's malicious whispers. "He wants to buy us out for pennies on the dollar. He's using this blight to his advantage." Clara nodded, her gaze steady. "I know, but we won't let him win. We'll focus on what we can control. We'll save what we can of the wheat, destroy the rest, and double down on our other ventures. And we'll remind people that this blight is affecting everyone, not just Blackwood." She began writing letters again, this time to neighboring ranchers, sharing information about the blight, suggesting cooperative efforts for crop destruction and discussing alternative income streams. She organized the ranch hands to meticulously clear and burn the blighted wheat, a difficult and disheartening task. Elias worked alongside them, his initial despair giving way to a grim determination. One afternoon, a delegation of local ranchers, prompted by Clara's letters and Silas's increasingly aggressive rumors, arrived at Blackwood Ranch. They were concerned about the blight, but also about Silas's attempts to exploit their collective misfortune. "We heard Silas is spreading stories, Elias," said a weathered rancher named Ben, "saying you're finished, that he'll soon have all the land." Elias looked at them, gratitude welling up within him. "Silas has always wanted Blackwood. This blight, it's just his latest opportunity. But Clara and I are fighting back. We're working on alternatives." Clara stepped forward, holding a basket filled with dried herbs and small bouquets of wildflowers. "We may have lost our wheat harvest," she said, her voice clear and confident, "but we haven't lost our spirit. We have excellent wool, our wildflower gardens are thriving, and I've found that certain herbs can be quite valuable for medicinal purposes. We can still weather this storm." The ranchers looked at Clara, at her quiet determination, her practical solutions. They saw not a helpless woman from the East, but a capable partner, a woman who understood the land and its potential. They saw the resilience that Elias and Clara had fostered at Blackwood. "We'll stand with you, Elias," Ben declared, his voice firm. Silas McCready won't divide us. We'll face this blight together. A sense of solidarity filled the air. The storm of the blight had descended, but it had also brought together those who refused to be broken. Elias and Clara, though facing new hardships, had found allies, had strengthened their position. The gathering storm was a threat, but it was also an opportunity to prove that Blackwood Ranch and its inhabitants were stronger than any adversity, and far more formidable than Silas McCready could ever imagine. The blight had taken a significant toll on Blackwood Ranch, decimating the wheat crop and forcing Elias and Clara to redouble their efforts on alternative income streams. The wool market was steady, and Clara's dried herbs and wildflower bouquets were proving surprisingly popular in town, but it was not enough to fully offset the losses from the wheat. The spectre of debt still loomed, and Elias felt the pressure mounting with each passing day. Silas McCready, sensing their vulnerability, intensified his campaign of misinformation. He spread rumors that Elias was secretly selling off parts of the ranch, that he was on the verge of bankruptcy, and that Clara, the Eastern lady, was a naive burden he could no longer afford. His goal was clear: to destabilize Elias and Clara further, to make them desperate enough to accept his predatory offers. One blustery afternoon, Elias found Silas waiting for him near the northern well, a place where Clara had discovered a promising vein of mineral-rich water. Silas leaned against his horse, a smug, knowing look on his face. "Heard you're having a tough time, Elias," Silas said, his voice laced with insincerity. "That blight was a real shame, but I suppose it's just nature's way of telling you that this land isn't meant to be worked by just anyone." Elias's jaw tightened. "We're managing, Silas." "Are you?" Silas chuckled. "Funny, I heard you're looking to sell off some prime grazing land, Shame, especially that northern pasture. Good water source there, I hear. Shame to see it go." Elias's eyes narrowed. He hadn't considered selling any land, but Silas's insinuation planted a seed of thought. What if they could use the very thing Silas coveted as leverage? "The northern pasture is valuable, Silas," Elias said, choosing his words carefully. "It has that new water source you mentioned, and it's prime grazing land. A man would have to pay a premium to acquire it." Silas's eyes lit up. He recognized the subtle shift in Elias's tone. "Oh, I'm willing to pay a fair price, Elias, especially if you're in a bind. I could give you a good offer right now, enough to tide you over maybe, and you wouldn't have to deal with the creditors anymore." Elias considered Silas's offer, the words Silas had used, "tide you over," echoing in his mind. It was a dangerous gamble, but desperation sometimes bred bold decisions. Clara had taught him the importance of exploring every avenue. "I'll consider your offer, Silas," Elias said, his voice measured, "but I'll need time, and I'll need to discuss it with my wife." Silas scoffed. "Your wife? What does she know about business? She's just a pretty face." Elias's gaze hardened. "Clara knows more than you think, Silas, and she's my partner in everything. If I make a decision, it will be ours." He met Silas's gaze directly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Silas, sensing he wouldn't get a definitive answer, rode off, his expression a mixture of annoyance and anticipation. He believed he had planted enough pressure to force Elias into a corner. That evening, Elias explained the situation to Clara. He laid out Silas's offer, the tempting sum of money, and the harsh reality of their current financial situation. Clara listened intently, her brow furrowed in thought. She knew Silas's offer was a trap, a way for him to gain control of the valuable northern pasture at a fraction of its worth, but she also understood the urgency of their financial predicament. "Silas wants that land," Clara said, her voice calm, "and he wants to see us fail. If we sell, he wins. If we don't, we risk losing everything else. We need a third option." Elias looked at her, hopeful. "What are you thinking?" "We don't sell the land to Silas," Clara stated. "Instead, we use its potential as leverage. The water source there is significant. We could explore the possibility of developing it further, perhaps even partnering with other ranchers who need reliable water access. We could also focus on maximizing the wool and herb production, using the profits to pay down our immediate debts." She paused, her eyes shining with determination. "It's a bigger gamble, Elias. It requires more work, more investment, but it means we keep our land. We keep our independence. We don't give Silas the satisfaction of seeing us broken." Elias considered her proposal. It was a bold plan, a risky venture that required immense faith and hard work. But it was their plan. It was a way to fight back, not just for survival, but for their future. "You're right, Clara," Elias said, his voice firm. "We won't sell to Silas. We'll make Blackwood valuable enough that he'll regret ever trying to strong-arm us. We'll develop that water source. We'll expand the gardens. We'll do whatever it takes." They spent the next several weeks working with an intensity fueled by renewed purpose. Clara organized the establishment of a small community well on the northern pasture, inviting nearby ranchers who were also struggling with water access to contribute to its development in exchange for a share of the water rights. Elias, inspired by Clara's vision, began planning for a larger, more organized cultivation of medicinal herbs, recognizing their potential as a consistent income source. The gamble was real. It required sacrificing immediate, tangible relief for the promise of long-term security and independence. But as Elias looked at Clara, at her unwavering belief and her tireless dedication, he felt a surge of confidence. They were no longer simply surviving. They were building. They were defying Silas McCready, not with anger, but with innovation and a shared vision. The gamble for survival had become a gamble for a brighter future, a future they would forge together, on their own terms. Silas McCready, accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and financial pressure, was infuriated when Elias and Clara not only refused his offer for the northern pasture, but actively began developing the water source and expanding their herbal cultivation. He saw their resilience not as strength, but as a personal affront. His whispers in town grew more venomous, his accusations more direct. He painted Elias as a desperate man making foolish gambles, and Clara as an ambitious outsider, manipulating him for her own gain. "You think you can outsmart me, Elias?" Silas muttered to himself one evening, watching the lights of Blackwood Ranch from a distance. "You think that woman can change the fate of this dust bowl? I'll see you broken, both of you." The rumors began to take their toll. Some of the smaller ranchers, already struggling, became wary of investing in the shared water project, fearing association with a potentially failing venture. Merchants in town, swayed by Silas's influence, began to demand stricter payment terms from Elias and Clara. The fragile network of support Clara had carefully built started to fray under the sustained pressure of Silas's machinations. Elias felt the familiar weight of despair begin to settle upon him again. He saw the worry in Clara's eyes, the weariness that no amount of hard work could entirely erase. He hated that Silas's malice was poisoning the very community they were trying to strengthen. "He's relentless, Clara," Elias said one night, his voice heavy. "Every time we take a step forward, he finds a way to push us back. He's poisoning our reputation." Clara, though visibly tired, met his gaze with a steady resolve. "His words are designed to break our spirit, Elias, but they are just words. Our actions, our work, that's what truly matters. We need to show people, not tell them, that Blackwood is strong." She proposed a bold idea, a harvest festival at Blackwood Ranch. It would be an event open to the entire community, a celebration of the land's bounty, showcasing the success of their new ventures, the high-quality wool, the thriving herb gardens, the abundant wildflowers, and the communal water source. It would be a demonstration of their resilience, a testament to what could be achieved when people worked together. Elias was hesitant. A festival, with Silas actively trying to discredit them. It felt like a risk, an open invitation for Silas to cause trouble. "Are you sure, Clara? Silas will use it against us. He'll twist it, make us look foolish." "He might try," Clara conceded, her expression firm. "But we will have the truth on our side. We will show them the results of our hard work, the potential of this land. We will invite everyone, including Silas. Let him see what he cannot have and what he cannot break." The planning for the festival was a significant undertaking. Clara rallied the neighboring ranchers who were still supportive, enlisting their help in organizing activities and spreading the word. Elias, despite his reservations, threw himself into the preparations, overseeing the repairs to the main gathering area, ensuring the livestock were well presented, and working with the ranch hands to prepare food and refreshments. The day of the festival dawned bright and clear. Families from surrounding ranches, as well as many townsfolk, began to arrive, their wagons and horses filling the open fields. Blackwood Ranch, for the first time in years, buzzed with laughter, music, and the scent of good food. Clara, dressed in her finest, though still practical dress, moved among the guests, her smile warm and welcoming. She showcased her herb gardens, explained the benefits of the medicinal plants, and proudly displayed the high-quality wool. Elias, more at ease than he had been in months, spoke with the ranchers about the new water system, emphasizing its benefits for the entire community. Silas Macready arrived with his usual arrogance, his eyes scanning the scene with open disdain. He saw the genuine camaraderie, the respect Elias and Clara commanded from their neighbors, and his frustration grew. He tried to sow seeds of doubt, making snide remarks about the quality of the wool and the dubious medicinal properties of Clara's herbs. But his words fell flat. The evidence of hard work and genuine success was all around him. During the main gathering, Elias stood beside Clara, his hand resting lightly on her arm. He felt a sense of pride he hadn't experienced in years. "You did this, Clara," he murmured. "You brought everyone together." Clara smiled, her eyes shining. "We did it together, Elias. This is our community, and our reputation is built not on whispers, but on the truth of our actions." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, Elias stood on the porch of the farmhouse watching the last of the guests depart. The festival had been a resounding success. Silas's venomous words had been drowned out by the collective voice of a community that had witnessed the truth of Blackwood's resilience. Elias knew Silas would not be deterred easily, but for now, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. Their reputation, once threatened by doubt and malice, was being rebuilt, not on the shifting sands of rumor, but on the solid ground of shared effort and undeniable success. The seeds of change Clara had planted were beginning to bear fruit, strengthening not only the ranch but the bonds of the entire community. The success of the Harvest Festival had indeed bolstered the reputation of Blackwood Ranch, creating a renewed sense of camaraderie among the local ranchers and a tangible shift in public opinion. Silas Macready's whispers had lost much of their sting, drowned out by the visible proof of Elias and Clara's hard work and ingenuity. However, Silas was not one to abandon his ambitions easily. He began to shift his strategy, no longer relying solely on slander, but on more subtle, insidious tactics. He started by offering Elias seemingly reasonable advice on managing the ranch, posing as a concerned neighbor, while subtly trying to glean information about their operations and future plans. Elias, wary but unwilling to appear overtly hostile, listened politely, offering little in return. Clara, however, saw through Silas's facade immediately. "He's probing, Elias," she warned him. "He wants to find another weakness, another way to exploit us. Don't let him get close." Elias heeded her warning, maintaining a polite but firm distance. But Silas was persistent. He began focusing his attention on Clara, attempting to charm her, to portray himself as a misunderstood businessman, a victim of Elias's stubbornness. He would ride by the ranch, calling out to her when she was working in the gardens, offering compliments on her flowers and her resilience. "You're too good for this harsh life, Clara," he'd say, his voice smooth. Such delicate hands meant for finer things. "Elias is a good man, but he's a rancher through and through. He doesn't understand your needs, your aspirations." Clara, though polite, always kept him at arm's length, her responses brief and non-committal. She saw the calculation in his eyes, the thinly veiled attempt to sow discord between her and Elias. She understood that Silas's goal was to break their partnership, to isolate her and make her question her place at Blackwood. One sweltering afternoon, while Elias and Jed were out mending fences on the far side of the ranch, Silas rode up to the house. Clara was tending to her herb garden, the air thick with the scent of lavender and sage. "Miss Evans," Silas called out, his voice carrying on the wind. "A moment, if you please." Clara straightened, wiping her brow. "Mr. Macready, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Silas dismounted, approaching the garden fence. "Just passing by, admiring your work. You've certainly made this place different." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the blooming flowers and thriving herbs. "It's a shame, though. All this effort. I still hear whispers in town, you know, that Elias is in over his head, that this whole venture is built on shaky ground." Clara met his gaze, her own steady. "Our ground is firm, Mr. Macready, built on hard work and a shared vision." Silas chuckled, a low, cynical sound. "A shared vision? Or a woman's naive dream?" "Elias is a proud man, Clara. He won't want to admit when he's made a mistake. He won't want to admit he needs help, especially not from his wife." He leaned closer to the fence, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "What if I told you I have a proposition that could secure your future, Clara? A way out should Elias's gambles fail. A chance for a life with more comfort, more security. A life where your talents would be truly appreciated." Clara felt a chill run down her spine despite the heat of the day. Silas was offering her a way out, a temptation to betray Elias, to abandon him in his time of need. It was a direct test of her loyalty, her trust. She looked at Silas, at the calculating gleam in his eyes, and felt a wave of disgust. She thought of Elias, his quiet strength, his growing trust in her, the future they were building together, brick by painstaking brick. "Mr. Macready," Clara said, her voice firm and unwavering, "I came to Blackwood Ranch fulfilling an obligation, but I have found so much more. I have found a partner, a home, and a purpose. My future is here, with Elias. Your proposition holds no appeal for me. I have no need for the kind of security you offer, built on deceit and the ruin of others." She turned her back on him, deliberately returning to her gardening, signaling the end of the conversation. Silas stood there for a moment, his face contorted with anger and disbelief. He had expected her to be tempted, to show some flicker of doubt. Instead, he was met with unwavering loyalty. He mounted his horse, his pride stung. He had misjudged Clara. He had underestimated the depth of her commitment, the strength of the bond she shared with Elias. As he rode away, he realized that his tactics of manipulation and subtle betrayal were proving ineffective. He would have to find a different approach, a more direct confrontation, if he ever hoped to break them. When Elias returned that evening, Clara recounted the conversation, her voice calm, but tinged with the lingering unease of Silas's attempt. Elias listened, his jaw tight with anger. He felt a surge of protectiveness for Clara, for the way Silas had tried to exploit her. "He won't stop," Elias said, his voice grim. "He tried to break us apart, to make you doubt me." Clara took his hand, her touch grounding him. "But he failed, Elias. He underestimated us. He underestimated our trust. Your trust in me, and my trust in you. That is our greatest strength." Elias squeezed her hand, the warmth of her touch banishing his anger, replacing it with a quiet resolve. Silas Macready could spread his lies and his temptations, but he could not break the bond that had been forged between them. Their trust in each other, hard-won and deeply cherished, was their shield, their strongest defense against the shadows that still lingered on the horizon. The direct confrontation with Silas Macready, though unsettling, had ultimately served to strengthen the bond between Elias and Clara. Clara's unwavering loyalty and clear rejection of Silas's advances had solidified Elias's trust in her, erasing any lingering doubts he might have harbored. He saw now more clearly than ever that she was not just his wife by obligation, but his partner in every sense of the word. The incident with Silas also served as a stark reminder that their peace was fragile. Silas would undoubtedly continue to seek ways to undermine them, and the challenges of ranching in the West were constant. Yet, Elias and Clara faced these realities not with despair, but with a quiet determination forged from shared experience. They continued to expand their operations, guided by Clara's keen business sense and Elias's growing understanding of the land. The communal water project on the northern pasture proved successful, fostering goodwill among neighboring ranchers and providing a much-needed reliable water source. The herb gardens flourished, and Clara began establishing connections with apothecaries in larger towns, securing more consistent orders for her valuable remedies. The wool production improved, and the Blackwood cattle, carefully managed and pastured, were gaining a reputation for their quality. Blackwood Ranch was no longer just surviving. It was slowly, steadily, thriving. The farmhouse, once a symbol of neglect, now felt like a true home, filled with the warmth of Clara's presence and the quiet contentment of Elias's partnership. The gardens bloomed, the house was tidy, and even the barn seemed to hold a lighter, more hopeful atmosphere. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Elias found himself watching Clara, her face illuminated by the flickering flames as she read aloud from a book of poetry. He felt a profound sense of gratitude, a deep well of affection that had grown from respect and shared hardship. "Clara," he began, his voice soft, I don't know what I would have done without you." She looked up from her book, her honey-colored eyes meeting his. A gentle smile touched her lips. "We have each other, Elias. That's what matters." He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers with hers. "You came here as an unwanted bride, but you became everything. My partner, my confidant, my home." The words, once difficult for him to express, now flowed with an ease born of genuine emotion. Clara squeezed his hand, her eyes shining. "And you, Elias, are the man who showed me that even in the harshest of lands, hope can still bloom. You taught me the meaning of resilience." Their quiet conversation was interrupted by the sound of a horse approaching. It was Jed, his face etched with a familiar concern. "Elias," Jed called out, dismounting quickly. "A rider just passed through. Said Silas McCready's been seen heading towards the Eastern Territories, talking about some kind of deal with a land speculator from out of state." He sounded agitated. Elias and Clara exchanged a look. The calm they had found was not an end to their struggles, but perhaps the quiet interlude before the next challenge. Silas McCready, thwarted in his attempts to break them directly, was clearly seeking new avenues to achieve his ambitions. "He's not done with us yet," Elias said, his voice grim but steady. Clara nodded, her resolve unwavering. "No," she agreed, "but neither are we. We've faced worse, Elias. We'll face whatever comes next, together." They knew that Silas's actions in the Eastern Territories could have repercussions, could bring new threats to their doorstep, but they also knew that they were no longer the isolated, desperate individuals they had been when Clara first arrived. They had built something strong at Blackwood Ranch, a partnership, a community, and a deep, abiding love. Whatever storm lay ahead, they would face it, side by side, their hearts united, their spirits unbroken. The calm was just that, a temporary lull, a moment of peace before the next test, a test they were now more than ready to meet. The fragile peace that had settled over Blackwood Ranch was as delicate as the first green shoots in Clara's garden. Elias and Clara had found a rhythm, a comfortable if unspoken understanding that permeated their interactions. He listened to her ideas, even began to implement some of them, and she in turn learned to read the subtle shifts in his moods, the unspoken concerns that shadowed his eyes. Hope, the calf, was thriving, a constant, warm presence in their lives, a living testament to their shared efforts. Yet the outside world, with its insatiable hunger for control, was beginning to intrude. Silas McCready, a man who thrived on gossip as much as he did on land acquisition, had begun to spread rumors through the sparsely populated territory. Whispers of Elias's financial ruin, of Clara's eastern softness, and of the Blackwood Ranch's imminent demise. These murmurs, carried on the dry wind, reached even the isolated homestead. Jed, his loyalty to Elias unwavering, tried to shield Clara from the worst of it, but the subtle shifts in the demeanor of the few traders who passed through, the guarded glances from neighboring ranchers at the infrequent cattle drives, told their own story. Some saw Clara as a weakness, an eastern interloper who had charmed Elias into a false sense of security. Others, fueled by McCready's venom, saw her as a sign of Elias's desperation, a last resort. Clara, though she tried to remain outwardly unaffected, felt the weight of these whispers. She had come to Blackwood seeking purpose, not scandal. She had poured her heart and soul into nurturing the ranch, into building a connection with Elias, and the thought that their efforts could be undone by malicious gossip was deeply unsettling. One afternoon, while Elias was out checking the newly established rotational grazing pastures, a sleek, black carriage, far grander than anything seen in these parts, rumbled up the dusty track to the farmhouse. A woman, impeccably dressed in a tailored traveling suit, stepped out, her face a mask of practiced concern. It was Amelia Thorne, Elias's cousin from Denver, a woman known for her sharp tongue and even sharper social maneuvering. Clara, surprised by the unexpected visitor, greeted her on the porch, offering a polite smile despite the unease that prickled her skin. Amelia's eyes, a cold, assessing blue, swept over Clara, then the house, a subtle disdain evident in her expression. "Clara, darling," Amelia purred, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I simply had to see for myself. The stories, they're quite alarming." "Stories?" Clara asked, keeping her tone even. "Oh, you know how it is out here," Amelia said, waving a dismissive hand. "Gossip travels faster than a prairie fire. They say Elias is on the brink of ruin, that he's had to resort to, well, unusual measures to keep the ranch afloat." Her gaze flickered pointedly towards Clara. Clara felt a flush creep up her neck. "I am Elias's wife, Amelia, and we are working to make the ranch profitable again. Elias has been very open to new ideas." Amelia gave a tinkling, insincere laugh. "Wife? Oh, darling. I heard it was more of a business arrangement, a pact to save the land. And judging by, well, everything," she gestured vaguely at Clara's simple dress and the humble farmhouse, "it seems that pact hasn't exactly brought you the prosperity you might have expected." The implication was clear. Clara was a burden, a drain, not a partner. The whispers were true. "We are making progress," Clara stated firmly, refusing to be cowed. "And Elias values my contributions." "Does he?" Amelia raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Or does he simply feel obligated?" "Elias is a proud man, Clara. He carries the weight of his family name, and when a man is desperate, he makes desperate choices. I just worry that you, my dear, might be another one of his mistakes." Amelia's words struck a nerve. They echoed the very doubts that had plagued Clara since her arrival. Was Elias truly coming to care for her, or was he simply bound by the letter of the law, by his father's desperate pact? The genuine warmth that had begun to bloom between them felt suddenly fragile, threatened by the harsh realities of Elias's precarious situation and the manipulative whispers of the outside world. As Amelia continued her subtle undermining, Clara's confidence wavered. She saw the judgment in Amelia's eyes, the subtle pity that felt more insulting than outright scorn. She had worked so hard to prove herself, to build something real with Elias, and now this woman, with her airs and graces, was casually trying to dismantle it all. When Elias returned, he found Clara visibly shaken, her usual composure frayed. Amelia greeted him with a dazzling smile, her voice syrupy sweet. "Elias, darling, so good to see you looking, well as can be expected under the circumstances." Elias's brow furrowed. He could sense the tension, the undercurrent of discord. He looked at Clara, noticing the strain in her posture, the guardedness in her eyes. He knew his cousin's manipulative nature, her tendency to stir trouble. "What have you been saying to Clara, Amelia?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm, a clear warning. Amelia merely smiled, a sly, knowing expression. "Just catching up, darling, and expressing my concern for you both. This land, it's a hard mistress, and sometimes even the strongest men can be led astray." Elias's jaw tightened. He knew Amelia's game. She thrived on drama, on sowing seeds of doubt. He turned to Clara, his stormy eyes searching hers. "Are you all right, Clara?" Clara forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine, Elias. Amelia was just visiting." But Elias saw the doubt flickering in her gaze, the hint of vulnerability Amelia had so skillfully exploited. He knew he had to address it, not just for Clara's sake, but for the future of Blackwood. The whispers were dangerous, and Amelia was a master at amplifying them. He had to make Clara understand that she was not a mistake, not an obligation, but an essential part of his life and of the ranch's survival. The fragile trust they had built was about to be tested. Amelia Thorne's visit cast a long shadow over Blackwood Ranch. Her subtle poison, administered with the precision of a seasoned manipulator, had succeeded in planting seeds of doubt in Clara's mind. Elias noticed the shift immediately. Clara, who had grown more open and engaged in recent weeks, became quieter, more reserved. Her smiles didn't quite reach her eyes, and she often found herself staring out at the vast, unforgiving landscape, her brow furrowed in thought. He tried to engage her, to recapture the easy camaraderie they had begun to share. He would ask her opinion on the new pasture rotations, bring her interesting finds from his rides, or simply sit with her in comfortable silence by the fire. But Clara, though polite, seemed distant, her mind miles away. The weight of Amelia's words, "A business arrangement, not a marriage, Elias is desperate, you're another mistake," seemed to press down on her, suffocating the nascent hope that had begun to bloom. One evening, as Elias was mending a saddle, Clara sat across the room, meticulously cleaning her sewing kit. The silence between them, once comfortable, now felt heavy with unspoken thoughts. "Elias," she began, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "Amelia, she said you only married me out of necessity, that it was a pact to save the ranch." Elias's hands stilled. He looked up, his stormy eyes meeting hers, and saw the vulnerability, the insecurity that Amelia had so expertly exploited. His heart ached with a mixture of anger towards his cousin and a deep protective instinct for Clara. "Amelia Thorne," he said, his voice low and measured, "sees the world through a lens of obligation and manipulation. She doesn't understand what has happened here, Clara, what we have built." "But the pact, Elias," Clara persisted, her voice trembling slightly. "Your father's agreement. It was meant to secure the ranch, wasn't it? And I was part of that agreement." She couldn't voice the fear that she was merely fulfilling a legal contract, a pawn in her father's and Elias's father's desperate plans. Elias put down the saddle and walked over to her, kneeling before her. He took her hands, his calloused fingers gently enfolding her own. "Yes, there was an agreement," he admitted. "A desperate measure from a dying man trying to protect his legacy. When I received that letter, I saw it as a burden, an unwanted complication." "I saw you as a complication, Clara." He squeezed her hands, his gaze intense. "But you are not a complication. You are everything that has kept this ranch from withering away completely. You brought life back to this house, to this land. You saved hope. You showed me that even in the driest soil things can grow." He paused, searching her face, willing her to believe him. "Amelia is wrong. This is not just a pact. It's becoming more. For me. And I hope, Clara, that it can become more for you too." Clara looked into his eyes, her own filling with unshed tears. She saw the sincerity there, the raw emotion he so rarely displayed. The weight of Amelia's words began to lift, replaced by the quiet conviction of Elias's gaze. I want it to be more, Elias," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I truly do." He pulled her gently into his arms, holding her close. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, a rhythm that had begun to feel like home. The embrace was not one of desperate obligation, but of genuine warmth, of burgeoning affection. But even as their bond deepened, the external pressures intensified. Silas Macready, sensing Elias's growing reliance on Clara and his subtle shift in strategy, grew more aggressive. He began to spread rumors of Elias's indebtedness, of his inability to secure crucial loans from the bank due to the ranch's poor standing. He hinted that he, Silas, was the only one willing to buy Blackwood at a fair price, thereby saving Elias from further humiliation. Jed, loyal as ever, reported these machinations with growing concern. "Macready's circling like a buzzard, Elias," he warned one evening. "He's trying to push you into a corner." Elias, his jaw tight, nodded grimly. "I know. He thinks I'm weak. He thinks we're weak." He glanced at Clara, who was listening intently, her expression determined. "But we're not. Not anymore." The weight of expectation, both internal and external, was immense. Clara was no longer just fighting her own doubts. She was fighting for the ranch, for Elias, for the future they were beginning to build. The whispers of doubt had been silenced for now, but the true test of their strength and the strength of their burgeoning relationship was yet to come. They had to prove not only to themselves, but to the world, that Blackwood Ranch and the union of Elias and Clara was far more than a desperate pact. It was a partnership forged in hardship, nurtured by resilience, and now blooming with an unexpected, potent love. Silas Macready was a man who understood the power of leverage, and he saw Elias Blackwood's precarious financial situation as his golden opportunity. With the drought still a looming threat, and Elias's unconventional methods raising eyebrows among the more traditional ranchers, Silas had intensified his campaign of subtle sabotage and rumor-mongering. His goal was clear: to break Elias and acquire Blackwood Ranch for a pittance. He began by subtly manipulating the market for livestock feed. Suddenly the prices, already high, spiked dramatically, making it nearly impossible for Elias to secure adequate supplies for his remaining herd. Then he spread whispers to the bank, suggesting that Elias's new, unproven methods were a sign of desperation, not innovation, and that any loans would be a risky investment. Clara, now deeply invested in the ranch's well-being, felt the pressure mounting. She saw the worry etched on Elias's face, the way he spent hours poring over ledgers, his brow furrowed in concentration. She knew their current success, however fragile, was entirely dependent on their ability to weather this storm of Macready's making. "He's trying to corner us, Elias," she said one evening, gesturing to a stack of bills. "The feed costs are becoming unmanageable. And the bank seems hesitant. Elias sighed, running a hand through his hair. "McCready's been busy. He wants this land, Clara, and he's not afraid to play dirty to get it." He looked at her, his gaze filled with a mixture of frustration and gratitude. "I appreciate you looking over the books. You have a good head for numbers." Clara smiled, a small, determined curve of her lips. "We're in this together, Elias. We'll find a way." Their efforts to secure feed led them to a neighboring town, a dusty settlement a day's ride away. Elias decided to go alone, hoping to negotiate directly away from McCready's influence. Clara, however, insisted on accompanying him. "It's too important, Elias," she argued. "If you're facing resistance, perhaps a different approach, a different face, might help. I can speak to some of the merchants, perhaps appeal to them directly." Elias hesitated. He was still adjusting to the idea of Clara being so actively involved in the ranch's business dealings, but he recognized the logic in her words. Her quiet confidence had begun to impress him, and her sharp mind was proving to be a valuable asset. "All right," he conceded, "but stay close. This is rough country, Clara." The journey was fraught with tension. As they rode, they saw signs of McCready's influence. Fewer cattle in the pastures of farms known to be friendly with Elias, hushed conversations that stopped abruptly as they passed. It was clear McCready was actively working to isolate them. In town, their reception was lukewarm at best. The feed merchants, their faces impassive, quoted exorbitant prices, citing shortages and increased demand. Elias's attempts at negotiation were met with polite but firm refusals. He could feel McCready's long shadow stretching even here. It was Clara who broke through the impasse. While Elias was speaking with a gruff merchant, she approached a younger man, the son of the general store owner, who seemed more approachable. "Excuse me," she said, her voice gentle but clear. "My husband and I are ranchers from Blackwood. We're finding it difficult to secure feed at a reasonable price. We understand there's a shortage, but we believe in fair trade." The young man, intrigued by her directness and unfamiliar presence, listened intently. Clara explained their situation, their innovative approach to ranching, and their commitment to making Blackwood thrive. She didn't beg. She appealed to his sense of fair play and opportunity. "My father believes in supporting those who work hard," the young man, whose name was Thomas, said thoughtfully. "We have a small reserve of feed, not as much as we'd like, but we can spare some. And we're always looking for reliable suppliers for our wool and hides." Clara's eyes lit up. "We can certainly provide that, Thomas. Blackwood wool is known for its quality." She spoke with a confidence that belied her humble origins. Her knowledge of the ranch's assets clearly communicated. A deal was struck. Clara secured a modest but crucial supply of feed, and in return, she promised regular shipments of wool and hides. As they rode away from town, Elias looked at Clara, a newfound respect in his eyes. "You did good, Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Real good. I underestimated you." Clara smiled, the weariness of the day momentarily forgotten. "We make a good team, Elias. That's what matters." But their small victory was short-lived. As they neared Blackwood Ranch, they saw a group of riders approaching, led by Silas McCready himself. His smile was a predatory thing as he rode towards them, his eyes glinting with triumph. "Well, well, Blackwood," McCready drawled, his gaze flicking to the wagons laden with feed. "Looks like you found some feed. Hope you paid a pretty penny for it. Prices are sky high, you know." Elias's jaw tightened. "We made our own arrangements, McCready." McCready chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "Arrangements? Or desperation? I hear the bank's not keen on lending you a dime. Seems like Blackwood's time is running out." He then turned his attention to Clara, his eyes appraising her with a cold, calculating gaze. "And you, Mrs. Blackwood, still playing dress-up as a rancher. Some women are just too delicate for this life." Clara's hand instinctively went to Elias's arm. She refused to be intimidated. "This life requires resilience, Mr. McCready. Something you seem to understand only when it suits your own greed." McCready's smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of anger. He was not accustomed to being spoken to in such a manner, especially not by a woman he considered a mere pawn. "You'll regret crossing me, Blackwood," he spat, his voice hardening. "This ranch will be mine, and when it is, you'll both be out on the street." With a final, menacing glare, he wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following suit. Elias watched him go, his fists clenched. The reprieve they had gained was temporary. Macready would not rest until he had Blackwood, but as he looked at Clara standing beside him, her chin held high, he felt a surge of defiance. They had faced Macready, they had secured their much-needed supplies, and they had done it together. The shadow of Silas Macready loomed large, but it was no longer capable of extinguishing the burgeoning light at Blackwood Ranch. The confrontation with Silas Macready left an unsettling tension hanging over Blackwood Ranch. Elias knew Macready was a man of his word, however twisted his intentions, and his threat was not to be taken lightly. The feed they had acquired was a temporary solution, but it wouldn't last forever, and the bank's reluctance to offer further loans remained a significant obstacle. Clara, too, felt the weight of Macready's animosity. She had seen the cold fury in his eyes, and she understood that he would stop at nothing to gain control of Blackwood. But instead of succumbing to fear, she felt a hardening resolve. She had invested too much in this place, in Elias, to let Macready's machinations destroy it. "We need to think beyond immediate needs, Elias," Clara said one evening, poring over the old maps her father-in-law had left. "Macready is playing a long game, and so must we. This debt to the bank is a noose tightening around our necks." Elias nodded, his gaze fixed on the faded lines of the maps. "I know. My father, he mortgaged the ranch heavily to begin with. And the drought? It's made things worse. If we can't secure a new loan or find a way to clear the existing one—" He trailed off, the unspoken threat of losing everything hanging heavy in the air. Clara traced a section of the map with her finger. "These old claim lines, they suggest there might be a spring further north on the old Gentry land. It was abandoned years ago. If we could secure access to that water, it could open up new grazing land, perhaps even allow us to expand the herd. That would give us something more substantial to offer the bank or even other investors." Elias looked up, his eyes widening slightly. "The Gentry Spring. I'd heard rumors about it, but it's miles from here and the land's been derelict for years. Macready probably has his eye on it too." "Then we must act quickly," Clara insisted. "If we can prove its viability, secure it, it could be our leverage." The idea was risky. It required a significant investment of time and resources they barely possessed. But it was a proactive step, a move away from simply reacting to Macready's pressure. Elias, seeing the spark of determination in Clara's eyes, felt a familiar stirring of hope, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to entertain for a long time. "It's a long ride," Elias said, "and the land up there is rough, dangerous even." "I can go with you," Clara offered without hesitation. "I can help navigate with these maps, and I want to be a part of this, Elias. I'm not just a wife out of obligation, I'm a partner." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the delicate woman he had once imagined, but a woman of courage and conviction, as strong and resilient as the land itself. "All right, Clara," he said, a genuine smile touching his lips. "We'll go together." The journey was arduous. They rode for 2 days, crossing rugged terrain, enduring harsh winds, and sleeping under the vast, star-strewn sky. Elias, accustomed to the solitude of his rides, found Clara's presence surprisingly comforting. She navigated with the maps, her sharp eyes spotting landmarks he might have overlooked, and her calm demeanor a steadying influence. They finally reached the area marked on the old claim. The land was indeed desolate, overgrown with scrub and dry brush, a stark testament to its abandonment. But as they followed Clara's directions, listening intently, they heard it, a faint, persistent trickle of water hidden beneath a tangle of rocks and weeds. Hope surged. They had found it. With renewed vigor, they began to clear the area, their hands working in unison, their shared purpose a silent, powerful bond. Elias, with his strength, cleared the larger rocks and debris, while Clara, with her smaller hands, carefully unearthed the spring, coaxing it to flow more freely. As the water began to pool, clear and pure, Elias looked at Clara, his heart full. "You did it, Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You found it. You brought water back to this desolate land." Clara smiled, her face streaked with dirt, her eyes shining. "We did it, Elias. Together." They spent another day securing the spring, reinforcing its banks and clearing a path back to it. Elias knew that securing access to this land, proving the spring's viability, would be crucial. It represented not just water, but a potential lifeline for Blackwood. On their return journey, Elias found himself sharing more with Clara than he had with anyone in years. He spoke of his father's dreams for the ranch, of the hope he had lost, and of the fear that Macready would succeed in destroying everything his family had built. "My father always believed in this land," Elias confessed, his voice heavy. "He saw its potential even when it fought him. I had lost sight of that. I was so consumed by survival, by the debt, I forgot what it meant to truly build." Clara listened, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You haven't forgotten, Elias. You just needed a reminder, and perhaps a partner to help you see it again." He looked at her, his stormy eyes filled with a gratitude that went beyond words. He realized then that Clara was not just a partner in business, but a partner in his life, in his very soul. The debt his father owed, the debt he felt to his legacy, was slowly being repaid, not just by securing the spring, but by finding a connection, a shared purpose, with the woman who had, against all odds, become the angel who claimed his heart. The challenge of Macready still loomed, but now Elias felt a fierce determination to fight, not just for the land, but for the woman who stood beside him, ready to face whatever the West threw at them. The discovery of the Gentry Spring was a beacon of hope, but Elias knew it was only a temporary measure against Silas Macready's relentless pressure. The water source was vital, opening up possibilities for expansion, but it didn't erase the immediate threat of the bank loan and Macready's persistent machinations. One blustery afternoon, a formal letter arrived at Blackwood Ranch, delivered by a courier with a grim expression. It was from the bank. Elias, his hands trembling slightly, opened it. The news was dire. Due to the ongoing drought, the ranch's perceived instability, and the rumors circulating about its financial woes, rumors Elias suspected Macready had actively fueled, the bank was unwilling to renew his loan. They were calling in the existing debt, demanding full repayment within 30 days. Clara watched Elias's face pale as he read the letter, the color draining from his cheeks. She knew, instantly, that this was the blow they had dreaded. 30 days. It was an impossible deadline. "They're calling the loan," Elias said, his voice flat, hollow. He handed the letter to Clara, his hand shaking. Clara read it, her heart sinking. 30 days to raise a sum that seemed astronomical. Despair threatened to engulf her, but she pushed it back, forcing herself to remain calm. She looked at Elias, at the raw pain and fear in his eyes, and knew she had to be strong for both of them. "We need to think," she said, her voice steady though her insides churned. 30 days. It's not much time, but it's not nothing. We have the spring now. We have the potential for new pastures. We need to act fast." Elias looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate hope. "Act how, Clara? We can't sell enough cattle to cover that kind of debt. Not with the market the way it is. Not with Macready manipulating everything." "We have other assets," Clara said, her mind racing. "Our wool, our hides, and the Gentry land, once we secure its access, could be valuable. Perhaps we can find an investor, someone who sees the potential, who isn't swayed by Macready's whispers." But finding such an investor in this remote territory on such short notice seemed like a near impossible task. The closest towns were small, their resources limited, and Macready's influence was far-reaching. Just as despair began to creep back in, Jed approached, his face grave. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice low. "There's a stranger here, says he's a representative from a land development company out of Denver. He's asking about purchasing land in the area." Elias and Clara exchanged a look. A land developer. Could this be an opportunity or another trap laid by Macready? The man introduced himself as Mr. Harrison, a representative of the Plains Expansion Company. He was polite, well-dressed, and spoke with an air of sophisticated business acumen that was rare in this rugged territory. He explained his company's interest in acquiring land suitable for expansion, particularly areas with access to water. "I've heard certain rumors about Blackwood Ranch," Harrison said, his eyes shrewd as he looked at Elias. "That it's struggling. My company, however, sees potential. We are looking for promising ventures, and we are prepared to offer fair compensation for viable land." Elias, wary but recognizing the potential, decided to be cautiously optimistic. He explained the situation with the bank, the importance of the Gentry Spring, and his vision for expanding the ranch. Clara, standing beside him, offered her insights into the potential for growth, highlighting the quality of their wool and hides and the untapped value of the Gentry land. Harrison listened intently, his expression unreadable. He asked probing questions, his gaze sharp and analytical, He seemed impressed by Clara's knowledge and Elias's determination, but his true intentions remained hidden. "Your situation is complex, Mr. Blackwood," Harrison said finally, tapping a pen against his notepad. "The bank's foreclosure is a significant hurdle, and Mr. McCready's influence in this area is not insignificant. However," he paused, a calculating glint in his eyes, "my company is willing to consider an investment. We would require a thorough appraisal of the land, of course, and a clear plan for repayment, and we would need assurances that Mr. McCready will not interfere." The offer was tantalizing, but Elias was cautious. This Mr. Harrison seemed too good to be true, his interest too sudden. He suspected McCready might be involved, perhaps using Harrison as a front to gain control of Blackwood through a different channel. "We would need time to consider your offer, Mr. Harrison," Elias said carefully, "and to conduct our own appraisals. We are not desperate, merely facing a challenge." Harrison smiled thinly. "Of course. I will be in the area for the next week. I suggest you consider my offer carefully. Time, as you know, is of the essence." He handed Elias a card. "My company is prepared to act swiftly should you decide to proceed. But remember, Mr. McCready is also a formidable negotiator. It would be unfortunate if this opportunity were to fall into his hands." As Harrison departed, Elias and Clara were left with a difficult decision. Was this a genuine offer of help, or another of McCready's elaborate traps? They knew McCready would do anything to get his hands on Blackwood. If Harrison was working with him, then accepting his offer would be like walking into a well-laid snare. "He seemed genuine, Elias," Clara said, her brow furrowed. "But his mention of McCready, it felt like a warning, or perhaps a threat." Elias nodded, his gaze troubled. "McCready is playing a dangerous game. He wants this land, and he's using every angle he can. This Harrison, he could be an ally, or another tool in McCready's arsenal." The 30-day deadline loomed, a ticking clock against their hopes. They had to decide, and quickly, whether to trust this stranger from Denver or to face McCready's wrath alone. The weight of expectation, the fear of failure, pressed down on them, but Clara, looking at Elias, saw a flicker of defiance in his eyes. They would not be broken. They would fight, but the path forward remained shrouded in uncertainty, a dangerous gambit in the unforgiving West. The arrival of Mr. Harrison and his offer from the Plains Expansion Company presented Elias and Clara with a precarious dilemma. The 30-day deadline for repaying the bank loomed like a storm cloud, and Silas McCready's relentless pressure made any traditional solution seem impossible. Harrison's offer of investment, though tempting, carried the distinct scent of deception, especially with his pointed mention of McCready's influence. "He's trying to force our hand, Elias," Clara stated, her voice firm as they discussed the proposition that evening. "He knows we're desperate, and the way he mentioned McCready, it felt like a veiled threat. Don't cross McCready, or perhaps he's the only one you should be dealing with." Elias paced the floor, his brow furrowed. "I agree. Harrison's too smooth, too eager. But what choice do we have? If we can't secure that loan, we lose everything, and McCready will get this ranch for pennies on the dollar." He stopped, running a hand through his hair. What if Harrison isn't working for McCready, but is merely trying to exploit the situation? What if he sees an opportunity to buy Blackwood from under McCready's nose? Clara considered this. It's possible. McCready has enemies, just as he has allies. Perhaps Harrison knows that, and he's betting on us choosing the devil we know, or rather, the devil we don't know, over McCready. Jed, who had been listening silently from his usual spot by the hearth, cleared his throat. "There's old man Hemlock over by Willow Creek. He's got more money than sense, and he ain't never liked McCready. Used to have dealings with your pa, Elias." Elias nodded slowly. "Hemlock. He's a bit of an eccentric, but he's honest, and he's certainly got no love for Silas." The idea of approaching Hemlock was a risk. He was a recluse, known for his distrust of outsiders and his deep-seated grudges. But he also possessed the wealth and the animosity towards McCready that could make him a viable alternative to Harrison and his mysterious company. "It's worth a try," Clara said, her eyes shining with a renewed sense of purpose. "We need to explore every possibility. If Harrison is a trap, Hemlock might be our escape route." The next morning, Elias and Clara set out for Hemlock's isolated homestead. The ride was long and arduous, taking them through rough terrain that tested their horses and their resolve. As they approached Hemlock's property, they saw a ramshackle cabin surrounded by a sprawling, albeit unkempt, collection of outbuildings. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney. Hemlock himself was a formidable figure, a grizzled old man with eyes as sharp as a hawk's and a handshake that could crush stones. He listened to Elias's explanation with a suspicious scowl, his weathered face etched with skepticism. "Blackwood money troubles?" Hemlock rasped, his voice like grinding stones. "Thought you boys were a bit tougher than that. Always knew that boy Silas was a snake." Elias, accustomed to dealing with gruff individuals, laid out their situation honestly, including Harrison's offer and the bank's ultimatum. Clara, sensing Hemlock's distrust, spoke up, her voice calm and clear. "Mr. Hemlock," she began, "we understand you have a long history with this land and with Silas Macready. We believe Blackwood Ranch has immense potential, especially with the Gentry Spring secured. We are not seeking charity, but a partner, someone who shares our vision and our dislike for Mr. Macready's methods." Hemlock eyed Clara, a flicker of something akin to respect in his sharp gaze. He had clearly underestimated her, just as many had. He appreciated her directness, her refusal to be cowed. "Macready!" Hemlock spat, a dark glint in his eyes. "That greedy dog, always trying to gobble up everything in sight. My father warned me about him and he was right." He leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Elias. "You say this land's got potential, water, and you're sure Silas ain't already got his greasy paws on it?" Elias explained about the Gentry Spring, the new grazing plans, and the quality of their wool and hides. Clara added details about their efforts to diversify, their careful management of resources. Hemlock listened intently, his initial suspicions slowly giving way to a calculating interest. Finally, after a long, tense silence, Hemlock grunted. "All right, Blackwood, I'll tell you what. I don't like Silas, and I owe your pa, your father. He was a good man, helped me out when no one else would." He spat on the ground. "I'll put up the money, enough to cover that damn bank and then some. But on one condition." Elias and Clara exchanged a hopeful glance. "Anything, Mr. Hemlock," Elias said. "You keep that land out of Silas Macready's greedy hands," Hemlock declared, his eyes blazing, "and you make something of it. You bring life back to this dust, and you send me a share of that good Blackwood wool every year. Deal?" Elias felt a surge of relief so profound it almost brought him to his knees. "Deal, Mr. Hemlock," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you. You won't regret this." Clara offered Hemlock a warm, genuine smile. "Thank you, sir. You've given us a chance to prove ourselves." Hemlock merely grunted, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Just make sure you do, and don't let that snake Macready get the better of you." As they rode away from Hemlock's homestead, the weight of the 30-day deadline still present, Elias felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. They had an ally, a rescuer, who understood the true enemy. The threat of Silas Macready was far from over, but now they had a fighting chance. The debt of honor that Hemlock had extended to Elias's father was now a lifeline for Blackwood Ranch, and Clara, the unwanted bride, had played a pivotal role in securing it. They were no longer just surviving, they were fighting back. The agreement with Old Man Hemlock was a godsend, a lifeline thrown to a drowning ranch. Elias and Clara returned to Blackwood with a renewed sense of purpose, the weight of the bank's ultimatum still present, but now tempered by a tangible hope. Hemlock's funds, transferred through a cautious but efficient lawyer, would cover the immediate debt, securing them precious time to rebuild and solidify their position. However, Elias knew that Hemlock's generosity was not without its conditions. It was a debt of honor, and he intended to repay it not just with wool, but with success. The true challenge, he understood, was not just securing the land, but making it thrive, proving to Hemlock, to the bank, and most importantly, to Silas Macready, that Blackwood was not a failing enterprise, but a rising one. Silas, meanwhile, was furious. His carefully constructed plan to force Elias's hand had been thwarted. He had anticipated Elias succumbing to desperation, perhaps even selling to Harrison, whom Silas had subtly encouraged as a potential buyer of his own future acquisition. Hemlock's intervention was a direct affront, a public display of his inability to control the situation. "That old fool Hemlock and that naive bride of Elias's," Silas seethed to his foreman, a hulking man named Bart. They think they've won, but this is far from over. Blackwood is still ripe for the taking. We just need to find a different angle. Macready, a man of persistent malice, began to explore other avenues of pressure. He knew Elias was now focused on the Gentry Spring and expanding his pastures. He decided to exploit Elias's potential need for resources and labor, and more importantly, to sow discord and doubt. He began spreading rumors about the Gentry land itself, whispers of it being cursed, of strange occurrences having happened there in the past, of it being unsuitable for livestock. He subtly offered employment to some of Elias's more transient hands, enticing them with higher wages and better conditions, hoping to poach valuable labor. He even began to discreetly scout the boundaries of the Gentry land, looking for any potential claim or legal loophole he could exploit. Clara, ever observant, noticed the subtle shifts. Jed reported hushed conversations among the hired hands, some of whom seemed unusually interested in Macready's offers. The whispers about the Gentry Spring, though outlandish, began to create a subtle unease. "Elias," Clara said one evening as they reviewed their plans for developing the Gentry Spring, "I think Macready is trying to undermine us again, not just with the bank, but with the land itself and with our workers." Elias nodded, his gaze grim. "He's a persistent pest. He knows we're stronger now, so he's trying to weaken us from the inside. We need to be vigilant." They decided to counter Macready's tactics directly. Elias, accompanied by Jed, made a point of openly working on the Gentry land, demonstrating its viability and their commitment to it. They spoke to their existing hands, emphasizing the importance of their loyalty and the long-term benefits of staying with Blackwood, especially now that their future looked more secure. Clara, using her persuasive skills, engaged the traders and merchants they encountered, subtly highlighting the positive changes at Blackwood and the potential for future business, directly countering any negative rumors Macready might be spreading. One afternoon, while Elias and Jed were reinforcing the fencing around the Gentry Spring, they encountered a small group of men, clearly not from the area, surveying the land with official-looking documents. Elias, his hand instinctively going to the Colt on his hip, approached them cautiously. "Afternoon," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "This is Blackwood Ranch property. Are you lost?" The men, startled, turned. The leader, a stern-faced man with a crisp suit, held up a document. "We represent Mr. Silas Macready. He has a prior claim to this land, based on old survey disputes. We are merely verifying its boundaries." Elias's blood ran cold. Macready had found a new angle, a legal one, a prior claim. "This land is under agreement with Mr. Hemlock," Elias stated firmly, his voice hardening. "And we are developing the spring. There is no prior claim that stands." The surveyor scoffed. "Mr. Macready's legal team is quite thorough. This could take some time to resolve. Perhaps it would be easier for you to negotiate directly with Mr. Macready now, before further complications arise." Elias felt a surge of fury, but he knew a direct confrontation would only play into Macready's hands. "Tell Mr. Macready that Blackwood Ranch is not for sale," he said, his voice icy, "and tell him that we will defend our claim with everything we have." As the surveyors retreated, Elias knew this was Macready's calculated gambit. He was using legal means, a labyrinth of claims and disputes, to tie up the land, to drain their resources, and to create an insurmountable obstacle to their plans. It was a devious move, designed to exploit their vulnerability and sow further uncertainty. Clara, who had ridden out to join Elias, saw the grim look on his face. "What happened?" Elias explained the encounter. Clara listened intently, her mind already working. "A prior claim based on old surveys? That sounds like Macready's brand of manipulation." She paused, thinking. "We need legal counsel, Elias. Someone who knows these land disputes, someone who can fight Macready on his own terms." The realization struck them both simultaneously. They had secured the finances, they had found water, they had even gained an ally in Hemlock, but they had underestimated Macready's cunning. He was now using the very system that was supposed to provide order and justice to undermine them. The fight for Blackwood Ranch had just entered a new, more dangerous and far more complex phase. It was no longer just about survival. It was about legal battles, about navigating the treacherous currents of claim disputes and property law, all while under the constant shadow of Silas Macready's ambition. The news of Silas Macready's prior claim on the Gentry land sent a chill through Elias and Clara. It was a shrewd, insidious move designed to exploit the complexities of land ownership in the West and drain their limited resources through a protracted legal battle. They had the water, they had Hemlock's backing, but a legal dispute could tie up the land indefinitely, rendering their efforts useless and playing directly into Macready's hands. "He's trying to drown us in paperwork," Elias said, frustration evident in his voice. He sat at the rough-hewn table surrounded by maps and legal documents they had managed to procure. "These old survey lines are vague, intentionally so, I'm sure. Macready's lawyers will twist them every which way." Clara, equally determined, pored over the documents with a magnifying glass, her brow furrowed in concentration. "We need someone who understands these old claims, Elias. Someone who knows how these disputes are typically resolved. Harrison mentioned a lawyer in Denver who specializes in land law. Perhaps that was a subtle hint after all." Elias scowled. "Harrison. I don't trust him. He feels like another pawn in Macready's game." "Perhaps," Clara conceded, "but his company could have contacts, knowledge we lack. If we're going to fight Macready on legal grounds, we need an expert. I can write to Harrison. We can frame it as seeking his company's advice, a preliminary inquiry, without revealing our full hand. If he truly wants Blackwood, he might offer us the name of a reputable lawyer, perhaps one who is not aligned with Macready." It was a calculated risk. Trusting Harrison felt like walking a tightrope, but the alternative, facing Macready's legal team alone, seemed far more perilous. Elias, though wary, agreed. Clara, with her polite but firm penmanship, composed a letter to Harrison, expressing their interest in his company's investment, but also highlighting their unexpected legal challenge and their need for expert advice. Harrison's reply arrived a week later, swift and almost too helpful. He provided the name of a respected Denver lawyer, a Mr. Sterling, who he claimed had extensive experience with Western land disputes. He reiterated his company's interest in Blackwood, but subtly hinted that any protracted legal battles could jeopardize their investment. The message was clear: resolve this quickly or the opportunity might vanish. Elias was still suspicious, but Clara saw a flicker of hope. "Sterling's name is reputable, Elias. I've managed to find a few references. He seems to have a good track record and no obvious ties to Macready." They decided to send their most trusted ranch hand, a quiet but capable young man named Ben, to Denver to consult with Sterling. Ben, discreet and observant, was tasked with conveying the details of Macready's claim and seeking Sterling's professional opinion. While Ben was away, Elias and Clara worked tirelessly to gather evidence supporting their claim to the Gentry land and the spring. They meticulously documented their improvements, the path they had cleared, and the work they had done to secure the water source. They collected testimonies from Jed and other loyal hands about their efforts. Clara even unearthed some of her father-in-law's old journals, which contained vague but potentially useful references to the original Gentry claim and its boundaries. Ben returned from Denver with a cautious prognosis from Sterling. The lawyer believed they had a strong case, especially with Hemlock's backing and the evidence of their development of the spring. However, he warned that Macready's legal team was formidable, and a protracted fight could be costly and draining. Sterling agreed to represent them, but his retainer was substantial, a sum they could only afford thanks to Hemlock's continued support. The legal battle began, a slow, grinding process that consumed their time and resources. Macready's lawyers filed motions, requested endless documentation, and scheduled depositions. Elias and Clara found themselves spending more time poring over legal papers than working the ranch. The stress was immense, a constant undercurrent of anxiety threatening to disrupt the fragile peace they had found. One particularly trying afternoon, as Elias was reviewing a stack of legal briefs, Clara sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "We're doing everything we can, Elias," she said softly. "Sterling is confident and Hemlock is steadfast. We just have to weather this storm." Elias sighed, leaning his head against hers for a brief moment. "It's hard, Clara. This legal fight, it feels like trying to wrestle shadows. Macready's not fighting fair, he's just trying to wear us down." "But we won't be worn down," Clara replied, her voice firm. "We have something worth fighting for. We have each other." He looked at her, his stormy eyes meeting her steady gaze. In that moment, amidst the legal battles and the relentless pressure, he knew she was right. They were fighting not just for the land, but for the future they were building together, a future that was far more valuable than any piece of paper or any legal claim. The legal labyrinth was daunting, but with Clara by his side, Elias felt a renewed sense of strength, ready to face whatever Macready threw at them. The legal wrangling over the gentry land was a slow, draining affair, a constant drain on Elias and Clara's time and resources. Macready's lawyers, true to Elias's fears, were masters of obstruction, filing endless motions and demanding mountains of documentation. The weight of the dispute pressed down on them, a constant source of stress, threatening to overshadow the progress they were making on the ranch itself. Yet the tide was slowly beginning to turn, thanks to Clara's foresight and Hemlock's unwavering support. The gentry spring, now fully developed and secured, was proving to be a vital asset. They had managed to tap into a steady, reliable water source, allowing them to expand their grazing land significantly. Elias, guided by Clara's insights, implemented more effective rotational grazing, and the cattle, though still recovering from the drought, were visibly healthier. Clara, meanwhile, had cultivated a thriving garden, providing them with fresh vegetables, and even a surplus they were able to trade with passing merchants. Their wool and hide shipments, facilitated by their new connection with Thomas in town, were becoming a steady source of income, carefully managed and reinvested back into the ranch. Old man Hemlock, true to his word, continued to offer his financial backing, not just covering the legal fees, but also providing a discreet line of credit for essential ranch improvements. He visited Blackwood occasionally, his gruff demeanor softening slightly with each visit as he witnessed their progress. "Looks like you're making something of this place after all," Hemlock grunted one afternoon, surveying the improved pastures and the sturdy new fencing around the gentry spring. Elias's pa would be proud. Elias, standing beside Clara, felt a surge of pride. "We're doing our best, Mr. Hemlock. Clara's ideas have made all the difference." Clara smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "We're a team, Elias, and we're learning." The success of their ventures began to ripple through the community. Word of the thriving gentry spring, the healthy cattle, and the quality of Blackwood's wool started to counteract Macready's negative propaganda. Some of the neighboring ranchers, initially hesitant, began to see Elias and Clara not as desperate individuals clinging to a failing enterprise, but as resilient innovators. One day, a delegation of ranchers, led by a respected elder named Jedediah, arrived at Blackwood. They had heard about their innovative water management and grazing techniques, and they were facing similar challenges with the lingering effects of the drought and the predatory practices of some of the larger landowners. "Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Blackwood," Jedediah began, his voice steady and respectful, "we've been watching what you're doing here. Your success with that spring and the way you're managing your land, it's something we could all learn from. We were wondering if you'd be willing to share your knowledge, perhaps form a cooperative, share resources, and present a united front against men like Macready who seek to exploit us." Elias and Clara exchanged a look of astonishment and hope. This was more than they had dared to dream of. A cooperative, a united front. It was a testament to their hard work, their resilience, and their ability to inspire trust. "We would be honored, Jedediah," Elias said, his voice filled with emotion. "We believe in working together, and we certainly have no love for men who try to profit from the misfortune of others." Clara added, "We're willing to share everything we've learned, the techniques, the contacts we've made. We can present a stronger voice, a united front against those who seek to divide us." The meeting was a success. The ranchers agreed to form a loose cooperative, sharing information, resources, and even pooling their efforts against common threats like Macready. This alliance was a significant turning point. It meant that Elias and Clara were no longer fighting alone. They had the support of their community, a collective strength that could rival even Silas Macready's influence. Meanwhile, Sterling, their lawyer, reported progress on the gentry land dispute. He had uncovered evidence of irregularities in the old surveys Macready's team was relying on, and the tide of the legal battle was beginning to shift in their favor. Macready, realizing he was losing ground legally and facing growing opposition from the ranching community, grew increasingly desperate and aggressive. The turning tide was palpable. Blackwood Ranch, once on the brink of ruin, was now a beacon of resilience and innovation. Clara, the unwanted bride, had not only secured her place, but had become an integral part of its revival. Elias, no longer a man solely defined by his burdens, was rediscovering his passion for the land, fueled by Clara's unwavering spirit and the support of their newfound allies. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, the future of Blackwood Ranch looked not just possible, but promising. The seeds of change, sown in the dusty plains, were finally beginning to blossom. The air in the Blackwood homestead was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the lingering drought. Silas McCready's presence loomed, a suffocating presence that Elias could feel in his bones. The letter, delivered by a taciturn rider earlier that day, was a formal demand for payment, a thinly veiled threat that Elias's overdue loan from McCready's private bank was now due in full, with an exorbitant interest rate that Elias knew was impossible to meet. McCready, ever the vulture, was circling for the kill. Elias stood by the window, staring out at the vast, unforgiving landscape that was his inheritance, his burden, and his lifeblood. His father's desperation had saddled him with this debt, a legacy of a promise made in better times, a promise that now threatened to swallow him whole. He had fought tooth and nail to keep Blackwood Ranch afloat, implementing Clara's innovative ideas, nurturing the land and slowly, painstakingly, coaxing life back into the parched soil. The pastures were recovering, the herd was growing stronger, and a fragile hope had begun to bloom in the heart of the ranch, and, Elias dared to admit to himself, in his own heart as well. Clara entered the room, her movements quiet and graceful, a stark contrast to Elias's coiled tension. She had shed the last vestiges of her eastern fragility, her hands now calloused from work, her face tanned by the sun, her eyes holding a quiet strength that Elias had come to rely on. She carried a tray with 2 steaming mugs of coffee, the rich aroma filling the room. "You've been staring out that window for an hour, Elias," she said softly, her voice a gentle balm against the harshness of his thoughts. She placed a mug in his hand, her fingers brushing against his. The simple touch sent a familiar warmth through him, a sensation that had become a cherished, if unspoken, part of their lives. He turned from the window, his stormy gaze meeting hers. "It's McCready. He's called in the loan." His voice was tight, strained. "Demanding full payment by the end of the month, with interest that's criminal." Clara's brow furrowed. She had always sensed McCready's avarice, his predatory gaze that seemed to linger on Blackwood Ranch like a persistent itch. She had seen the way he spoke to Elias at the infrequent town gatherings, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. "He's trying to force you out, Elias," she stated, her voice firm. "He knows we're recovering. He wants Blackwood for himself." Elias grunted, taking a slow sip of the coffee. "He's always wanted it, ever since my father refused his first offer, all those years ago. Now he sees weakness, and he's moving in." He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture one of pure frustration. "I've sold nearly everything I could spare. The extra horses, some of the older equipment. It's not enough, not even close." The reality of their precarious situation settled heavily between them. All their hard work, all the late nights planning, the early mornings toiling in the fields, the shared triumphs, it all felt threatened by McCready's insatiable greed. Clara sat down opposite him, her eyes filled with a resolute determination that mirrored his own. "We won't let him win, Elias," she said, her voice unwavering. "We've faced down worse than Silas McCready. We've faced down the drought, the storms, the desperation. We'll find a way." "What way, Clara?" Elias's voice was laced with despair. "We're out of options. He's got the law on his side. This loan agreement was ironclad. If I can't pay, he'll take the ranch, every acre, everything we've built." The thought of losing Blackwood, of seeing McCready's gaudy Triple M brand on his land, was a pain almost too great to bear. Clara reached across the table, her hand covering his. Her touch was gentle yet firm, a silent anchor in the rising tide of his despair. "We have something McCready doesn't have, Elias. We have each other. We have the loyalty of Jed and the ranch hands. We have the land that's finally starting to breathe again. And we have our wits." She leaned forward, her honey-colored eyes shining with a fierce light. "We need to be smart. McCready expects us to crumble. He expects us to beg or to surrender. We won't do either. We need to find something he doesn't expect." Elias looked at her, the weariness in his eyes slowly being replaced by a spark of the old Blackwood resilience. Her unwavering faith was a powerful force, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. He knew she was right. Surrender was not an option. Not now, not ever. "What do you have in mind?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. Clara's lips curved into a determined smile. "You mentioned your father always said the land tells you what it needs. Perhaps it's telling us something else too, something Macready, with all his greed, has overlooked." She paused, her gaze thoughtful. "The old maps you found, did they show any other water sources? Anything significant? Perhaps overlooked?" Elias frowned, his mind replaying the details of the worn maps. There were notations about an old forgotten spring, further north, near the foothills. "My father always said it was unreliable, barely a trickle most years. He never bothered with it." "Unreliable, perhaps, but perhaps not entirely useless," Clara countered, her mind already racing. "If we could access it, even for a few months, it could be enough to keep the herd healthy, enough to buy us time, and perhaps enough to show Macready that we are not easily defeated." The idea was audacious, bordering on desperate. The northern foothills were rough terrain, difficult to access, and the spring had a reputation for being fickle. But as Elias looked at Clara, at the unwavering belief shining in her eyes, he felt a flicker of renewed hope. She had a way of seeing possibilities where he saw only insurmountable obstacles. "It's a long shot, Clara," he said, his voice still tinged with caution. "All the best risks are, Elias," she replied, her smile widening. "And we're not taking this risk alone." Elias met her gaze, the unspoken understanding passing between them. They were a team, forged in the fires of hardship, bound by a shared future. He knew Macready wouldn't expect this. He wouldn't expect them to venture into the unknown, to chase a ghost of a spring. He expected them to break, but they wouldn't break. They would fight. And with Clara by his side, Elias Blackwood felt for the first time in a long time that they might just have a fighting chance. The shadow of Macready was long, but the light of their newfound partnership was beginning to push it back. The days following Macready's confrontation were a whirlwind of desperate activity. The northern spring had bought them time, but not a solution. The loan was due in 2 weeks. Elias spent sleepless nights poring over his father's ledgers, while Clara, in the small study, meticulously re-examined the old claim maps. Her eyes caught a faint, almost invisible notation, a series of dots and dashes near the foothills. Cross-referencing it with her agricultural books, she had a wild hunch. The notation suggested the possibility of mineral deposits, specifically silver. It was a desperate gamble, but the only hope they had. The next morning she presented her findings to a skeptical Elias. He was hesitant, seeing it as a fool's errand, but Clara's unwavering conviction finally swayed him. "We'll look," he said, "but don't get your hopes too high." They organized a small expedition and set out. For days they sifted through rock and soil, their hands raw, their spirits tested. Just as despair began to set in, a young ranch hand let out a shout. He held up a rock glinting with unmistakable veins of silver. It was real. The discovery wasn't a king's ransom, but it was enough to pay off Macready and enough to secure the ranch's future. The return journey was triumphant. As they rode back, Elias looked at Clara. Her face was smudged with dirt, but her eyes shone brighter than any silver. She had come as an unwanted bride, but she had become his partner, his confidant, the angel who had not only saved his ranch, but had also reclaimed his heart. The final confrontation with Macready was swift and decisive. Elias, armed with proof of the silver, and a team of lawyers Clara had discreetly contacted, met Macready in town. The man's arrogance evaporated, replaced by cold fury as Elias, with Clara by his side, presented the evidence of his predatory loan and the valuable resources on Blackwood land. Macready was outmaneuvered and forced to withdraw his claim, his reputation in tatters. Back at Blackwood Ranch, under the vast star-studded sky, Elias took Clara's hands. "You saved us, Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved this ranch. You saved me." Clara smiled, her eyes shining. "We saved us, Elias. This is our legacy now, our home." He pulled her close, their embrace a testament to their shared journey and the love that had blossomed amidst the dust and struggle. The Blackwood Ranch, once a symbol of a dying legacy, was now a testament to resilience, hope, and the transformative power of an unwanted bride who had become the angel who claimed his heart. Their story, etched into the very soil of the West, was just beginning.